This guy was a poor worker with a normal life, but his girlfriend betrayed him for being poor and talentless. She left him for a guy who was getting rich, but what she didn't expect was that Lin wasn't exactly as poor as she thought. Lin became a billionaire by discovering a system that allowed him to change jobs every week, earning huge sums of money, as well as luxury cars and properties. His girlfriend's betrayal was no reason for sadness. In fact, it opened doors for him to meet new women who valued him and were even more attractive, with incredible curves. The story begins with Lin Yi getting fired from his job and, apparently, they didn't even give him a reason. He then calls his girlfriend, Sichi Lu, to try and break the news, but before he can say anything, she tells him she wants to break up because Lin is still poor, even after all the time they've spent together. She tells him he doesn't need to come to her party anymore and that he should never call her again. As she steps into the elevator on the worst day of his life, Lin notices a suspicious blue light around him. Suddenly, a beautiful woman dressed as a maid called him master, saying she was his servant, Lin Wei, and welcomed him to the full professional experience system. Basically, he can try a new profession every week, and completing all the tasks will give him a final reward. Clearly on cloud 9, he thought it was finally time to stop being a complete nobody, as if getting the new job wasn't enough. He also won an initial prize of 10 million and a Pagani Zonda valued at 30 million. When he remarks that he could be a driver for the rest of his life with a car like that, she reminds him that he could only try one profession per week. But, apparently, Lin didn't care about that, as he was making a lot of money. Next, she takes the car key from him, saying he needed to claim the Peninsula Hotel and, after giving the coordinates for the car's location, she hands him the key. When he gets to the garage, he notices a beautiful woman in front of him named Ji Qing Yang. Apparently, she was having some trouble with her car, and, when he asks what happened to Miss Ji, she tells him what had happened, and he asks if she would like a ride, and she clearly accepts. Suddenly, the spoiled young man arrives hugging her, saying he would give her a ride, since Lin seemed to be broke. But apparently, she had already rejected this young man a few times before and turned him down again. Then Lin takes matters into his own hands and says that he will take care of it, of taking her wherever she needs to go. Then, she tells her stalker that she didn't mind riding in a broken-down car. But let's just say they were both suddenly surprised when they saw the 30 million Pagani, which impressed the spoiled girl. Finally, Lin asks Miss G to get in the car, this time humiliating the kid's ride as they climbed in, to the car. The spoiled kid begged for a ride, but he was left behind eating the Pagani's dust. She, impressed with his car, asks if it was really his, since he was just an employee in the sales department recently. And he says yes, and that he was a rich kid who was just there to experience what it was like to be poor. Then Lin asks her to start a trip on the BlaBla app and she becomes his first customer. And so he did. With the request made, he took her to the location and finally said goodbye to his new private driver. Suddenly, the girl from before appears in miniature form on his shoulder, congratulating him for completing his first task, rewarding him with 50 million. He was impressed with the amount he received for completing just one trip. At the Peninsula Hotel, his ex was with her new rich boyfriend, wishing she had met him sooner, and suddenly she notices that Lin was also there. Seeing him, she thought he had gone there just to win her back, but he made it very clear that he was only there to spend money. So, she decides to call the security guards to throw him out, and as if that wasn't enough, she still insults him, calling him a beggar. But when the security guards arrived, they all bowed before him, leaving, both her and her boyfriend impressed by the authority he had over that place. And this only increases when one of the security guards calls him to the meeting room to report on his performance. Only then did the Viper realize she had lost a rich man. In the meeting room, an employee enters, saying there was a customer who wanted to file a complaint against them, just for having rented a car that was already being used by some VIP users. With that, he leaves the finances with them and decides to go to the location to talk to the girl. When she opens the door, he says he would solve her problem, and her name was Gujin Sua, but I'll just call her Jin. With that, the protagonist asks if she wouldn't like to rent his Pagani, but since she couldn't afford to rent supercars like that, she says she didn't know how to drive such a car. With that, he suggests taking her where she was going, and she ends up accepting, asking him to wait a bit while she got ready. While she was getting ready, he had a privileged view that few in life get, and she was finally ready. In the main hall, the Viper was dumping her new rich boyfriend, and he finally realized what kind of woman she was. Yes, she was showing off, thinking that Lin would actually forgive her just because they had been together for so many years. Her friend started to get a little jealous of her, but she says she would take her for a ride in the Pagani later. But little did she know that Lin was already in very good company. And Cece approaches him as if nothing had happened, saying that she would take care of his business from now on. With all the kindness in the world, Lin says it was none of her business who that girl was, and here she plays the victim, asking if he didn't love her anymore. She even says that the girl by his side didn't have skills as good as hers to handle his business. Then, Jin joins the game and says that a while ago, he had said she was much better than his ex-girlfriend, and takes the opportunity to add that she also had great flexibility. He then decides to leave, and his ex said she was willing to be even the second option if he wanted, but he tells her to get lost, among other things, and that she shouldn't bother him anymore, leaving her on the floor and getting revenge for being humiliated over the phone. Inside the car, she tells him where she was going and apologizes for bothering him, but it was no bother at all, since she had also helped him with the problem at the hotel. Where she was going, her friends were, as she always said. A short time later, they arrive in his Pagani, and her friends were impressed by her boyfriend's car. With that, she says she had helped him before and asks him to do the same for her now. Finally, Lin says goodbye to her as if he were really her boyfriend. In another part of town, an old woman was complaining that Lin was 10 days late with the rent, and her daughter was trying to calm her down, while the old woman complained that he might just run off. Someone ended up knocking on the door, and when she opened it, it was Lin, who was there to say his goodbyes as he was moving out and had only come to pack his things. The landlady then says he needed to pay what he owed before leaving. He owed $2,000 in rent, and she was getting completely worked up. But he sent $4,000 to her account as compensation for the past delay, given that he was moving out so suddenly. The landlady asked if he had found something new, and he said that he was now a driver for a ride-sharing app. As he headed to his car, the old woman decided to follow him, just to see if he had stolen anything from her house, and they came across a beautiful Pagani parked right in front of her residence. When she asks him where his old car is, he finally reveals that he is the owner of the Pagani, the one parked right there, leaving her speechless that he had become so rich so suddenly, and he simply says that he stopped pretending, since he was just experiencing what it was like to be poor. As he sped away, the girl started to think she might have a chance with him, but her mother says that since he wasn't good enough for her, when he was poor, she has no chance at all now that he's rich. At the hotel he was now managing, his employees booked him a presidential suite, and he was finally able to have a proper meal after so long. Then he gets a message from Miss G asking him to pick her up, since she was done with work. 30 minutes later, he had gone to pick up the beautiful princess, and as soon as she gets in the car, he asks if she would like to place an order. A little confused about what he was talking about, she asks what kind of order it was, and he says it was for the ride-sharing app, otherwise he wouldn't make any money. She, realizing that he was taking this ride-sharing business seriously, wonders how someone so dedicated could have possibly been fired. She worked at the same company as him, but held a management position or something similar. Suddenly, the girl from before appears, telling him not to worry because Miss G couldn't see her. She then says that the girl in his car was very beautiful, and the system gave her a score of 85. Additionally, he successfully completed the second request and received a new task, where he needed to transport 2 women with a score of 85 or higher, on top of other rewards. Then Lin asks, what kind of woman is considered to have a score above 85, and she says it would be a woman like Miss G. After that, the beautiful lady in his car asks if he would take her home, and it seemed like he was having a harder time than she was. When he asks if her problem is personal or business related, she says it's about business, since they needed to organize a launch event soon and still hadn't been able to book a hotel. When he tells her to go to the Peninsula Hotel, she thought they would have no chance of getting a booking at an amazing hotel like that. Lin replies that this wasn't necessarily true. After all, life is full of surprises, and she compliments him on being so good with words, asking him to turn the car around and go to the Peninsula Hotel. However, she says that if they don't get a deal, she won't pay for the detour. And when he asks what would happen if he got the deal, she asks him what he would like as a reward. And he says she would have to do 10 squats in front of him, telling her to look up the type of squat on her phone. She realizes it was too embarrassing, but soon remembers that she had already called earlier to try and make a reservation, and the manager had told her that nothing was available at that time, so her chances of winning were practically guaranteed, and she ends up accepting his proposal. At the hotel reception, Miss Shi says she would like to speak with manager Wang, and the receptionist wonders if this was her boss's new mistress, pretending to be poor again, and that she was much more beautiful than his ex-girlfriend. In the lobby, the manager greets her, and she asks if they would have a hotel auditorium available to rent, and thanks to Lin's help, who was behind her directing everything, the manager says he could arrange the rental for any day she wanted. Over the moon, she thanks him and gives him the date she would like to rent it. After that, Her problem was solved, and Lin says it was now time to fulfill her promise, the bet they had made earlier, and asks if she still remembered it. But still, since she was the company's president, she had to keep her promise. And he gets closer to her so she could do the squats. However, since they were still inside the car, she asks if they couldn't go to her place and talk about it. And since it was very small and cramped in there, it was better for them to go to her house. He then speeds up to get there as quickly as possible, leaving her wondering why he was so excited about it. Upon arriving at the Divine Lady's house, she asks if he would like to receive his payment at that moment, and he clearly answers yes. Before starting, she says she had never done this kind of thing before, so he shouldn't complain if she didn't do it right. She finally begins her workout. Apparently, the protagonist was enjoying every second of it, but unfortunately she only had time to do one, as her father suddenly appeared, asking what his daughter was doing, leaving them both completely speechless. After that sudden appearance, Miss G, completely embarrassed, asks what her father was doing there, and she says that Lin was actually her new yoga instructor. Apparently, her father didn't buy the nonsense, since no instructor just stands there watching without doing the moves together, and she says he was actually an advanced instructor, for verbal guidance only. The old man then sits down next to Lin this time, and asks him his name and what he did for a living, and Lin says he was a rideshare driver, but for sports cars, leaving the old man wondering what kind of car he owned that made his daughter get in with him. When he realizes it was the Pagani parked in the lot outside, his treatment of Lin changed overnight, saying that he could now entrust his daughter to him, but she says they don't have that kind of relationship. Then, her father says they could go to the family grandfather's birthday together, and tells them to continue with their fun, finally leaving the two alone. The Divine Lady says her father had misunderstood the situation, and the protagonist takes an action that honestly impressed me, showing he wasn't there to play, telling her to continue from where they left off. She pushes him away before the situation gets more delicate, but he was just referring to the exercises from before, while she was thinking about educational activities. Then he receives a message on his cell phone from people at his old company, where he used to work, inviting him to dinner at a restaurant that very night, and he says goodbye to Miss G, saying they would pick up where they left off later. Upon arriving, a woman who was apparently the highest-ranking person there asked him to sit down and started praising him excessively. The real reason for this invitation was actually to make him jealous, since one of the employees there had just been promoted to head of the sales department, and Lin's theory was completely correct. Suddenly, a restaurant employee asks whose Pagani was downstairs, and as Lin was asking what had happened to the Pagani, the guys who would never own a car like that in their lives were impressed with the machine. The employee then says it was blocking other cars, so he asked the owner to move the car. When one of the employees from Lin's old company tells him to calm down a bit, Lin reveals that the Pagani was actually his. With that, he quickly put Process Exeni, the one who was only there to humiliate him, in his place, and he says goodbye to the girl who had invited him, saying he would take some food to eat at home. After that, the snake from before apologizes to Lin, asking him to stay a little longer, but Lin rejects his apology, as there was no reason to accept the request for forgiveness. Miss Jin ended up accompanying him back home, and he asks if she would like to place an order so he could complete his task again. She clearly accepts his request, but her total score was only 84 points, not meeting the necessary requirements to complete the task. To him, this score was wrong, and he asks if she knew any way to increase a woman's charm. She takes an item of clothing out of her bag to put on, improving her appearance a bit, and asks what he thought, already thinking he wanted something. After the new scan, she got 85 points and he won a villa in Kyushu. Therefore, he needed to meet with the sales manager to receive his reward. After that, she asks him if he wouldn't like to come up to talk more, since her husband was on a business trip that day, but Lin kindly rejects her offer despite wanting to accept it, and they finally say their goodbyes. The next day, he goes to the Kyushu sales department to receive his reward, and an employee who was a former colleague of his asks him what he was doing there. He replies that he had gone to receive a deed to his property, but since she couldn't believe him, she starts pushing him until a superior of hers asks what she was doing. The manager orders him to leave immediately. Then, she offered to show the property to the protagonist, but the girl from his former department was still insisting that he couldn't afford any of the villas they had. The manager then orders her to go to human resources, since she has just been fired, saying she never wanted to see her there again for lying so much. However, the girl says it wasn't a lie, and that she knew everything about him, but in fact, that was just what she thought, as Lin had bought 9 villas in Kyushu. Only then did the girl realize she no longer knew her old classmate. Even the protagonist was impressed with this news. The manager apologizes for what happened before, but he says it was okay. After all, she had already fired the previous employee. After a while, with the formalities out of the way, he asks her to hand over the deeds to her properties, and so she did. Along with all the keys, he gets news from Miss Jean that the two guys from before, who tried to humiliate him at the restaurant, were fired. She then sends him a message, asking if he had anything to do with it, and she reveals that she investigated the reason for their dismissal and fired them both, immediately because of it. After talking for a bit, she asks him to pick her up from the office, as her car was still under repair. After this, he receives a new task where he needed to get 5-star reviews to receive a new reward. At the end of the ride, he asks Miss Jean not to forget his stars, and she says she would trade the squats for the 5-star review. However, he pushes forward, quickly, saying he didn't want 5 stars if she wasn't going to do the squats, so he wanted her to do the 9 that were still left. After that, she finally gets out of the vehicle, and Miss Jin notices that she just got out of the protagonist's car. So, he suddenly tries to come up with an excuse, even though she hadn't even asked anything yet. Jin then starts to think that she wouldn't have a chance with him, since he is apparently interested in Miss Ji. She still thinks this, even though she is married. Her brain cells on this topic were definitely left at the hospital. The Divine Lady then calls for Jean, so they can get back to work, but not before leaving a 5-star review for our protagonist. We continue with Lin, accepting a new ride on the BlaBla app, but before arriving at the location, the client asked him to pretend to be her boyfriend, and he clearly accepted the young lady's request. Upon arriving at the location, he met a beautiful lady, and her name was Yu, a famous streamer, and, let's just say, she was also quite taken with him. Yue's parents arrived to meet the young protagonist, but when he says he's a BlaBla driver, their expressions clearly showed no approval. The little damsel even tries to explain to her parents that being a BlaBla driver has been very profitable lately, but they still don't really believe her. Before the situation could get any worse, Yue rushes her parents to go to the party, but Lin's car only had room for 2 people, so they would have to go in another car. As they were walking to Lin's car, they were clearly thinking that their daughter had gotten a terrible boyfriend. That was until they saw the Pagani, parked outside, and Lin asks the beautiful damsel to get into his ride. When her parents saw that Lin was actually very wealthy, their expressions and the way they acted changed completely. On the way to where Yue was headed, she asks if it would be a problem to have a live stream inside his car, but he tells her to make herself comfortable and, in return, he would like her to give him the comps of, in her live stream, people thought he had pulled some kind of stunt to be able to rent a car like that, but she clarifies that he was a BlaBla driver. However, in her thoughts, she was saying that if he was willing to spend money on her, she didn't think she'd play hard to get. I guess you get the picture here. At the end of the ride, she gave him the 5 stars promised earlier, and the rabbit from before appears in an unusual place this time, rewarding him for completing his previous goal of 5-star reviews. After that, he asks Yue if she knew the area well, since he needed to get a new phone, and she decides to help him with his problem. With that, they go to the Bitten Apple store, and when he chooses one he'd like to buy, she says they could buy a much cheaper phone online, but he doesn't see the need to do so. When the salesman returns to give Lin the phone, he offers another case to give the phone more protection. But since he didn't really like using cases, he replies that his intention was actually to buy a few more phones, so if one breaks, he'll just replace it with another. When he says he'd like 5 units of each color, and also a MacBook, Yue realizes the absurd amount of money the protagonist had, and on her live stream, things were also going very well, since people love to see that kind of thing. Leaving the store, the beautiful lady asks if he'd like to go to one more place to buy her some more things, and he decides to go to a watch store this time. But it was clear that the saleswoman in this store was a bit arrogant, as she judged a book by its cover just because the girl was a streamer. He then chose a watch to buy, but the saleswoman wasn't very helpful and said that the display models could only be shown if payment had been made beforehand, which doesn't make much sense, since we first need to see something up close to actually buy it. Suddenly, another customer arrives with his companion, and it was clear that the difference in treatment here was absurdly large. And when the simpleton's companion becomes interested in one of the watches, the bitter saleswoman brought the watch over to show it to her up close. With that, Lin was outraged by the absurd difference in treatment she gave the simpleton, feeling completely looked down on in that store. However, she replies that her service was equivalent to the level of her customers, so she expected his understanding. Clearly, he became even more enraged, especially since she was nothing more than a snake who only judged a book by its cover. And in the end, he decides to go to another store. At the competitor's store, they were very well received, unlike at the previous one. Since Lin didn't have much experience in that area, he asked Yue to help him choose something, but she wasn't very familiar with that price range either. The people on her stream, live, told him to buy a watch from the anniversary collection, and so Lin did as the people said and asked for the watch from the anniversary collection that they had, leaving all the attendants there completely impressed with his attitude. When Lin asks if this wouldn't be possible, she says that it clearly would be, but since that watch wasn't in stock, because it was a limited edition, they would need to order it, and she would personally deliver it to his home when it was ready. When Yue asks if they didn't have that watch in such a large store, one of the attendants says there were only 6 of those watches in the world, so it wasn't even in the country. With all this commotion, the people at the Viper's store were curious to see who had bought the 10 million watch, but upon arriving at the store, she realizes who had bought it was precisely the boy she had just looked down on and had the audacity and nerve to still call him over to check out her store. But when she said he was too poor for her store's level, he even gently rejected her offer, leaving her on the floor completely regretting her previous arrogant attitude. Upon leaving the store, he apologizes to Yu for making her accompany him on his entire trip, and gives her a new phone as a reward and apology, and she finally thanks him, and they say their goodbyes after their last ride. Lin had gone to a racetrack to receive his reward, and upon arriving at the reception, the girl says they had received a VIP reception that day, so they were closed to the public. However, Lin says he wasn't there to play, but to see the manager, and asks her to help him with that. Suddenly, a young man named Kim Han enters, asking why the protagonist was there, since he had booked the entire place just for himself. The assistant apologizes, saying that the young man was only there to talk to the manager, while her twin sister took Lin to his destination. He then asks who the guy was that had rented the entire racetrack, and the assistant says he was a celebrity, and that not many people dared to mess with him in the manager's office. He was clearly very well received, and the manager reveals to everyone there that Lin was now the owner of their racetrack, so from now on he was the boss there. After that, the manager takes Lin for a walk around the racetrack and introduces him better to the place he now owned, and asks if our protagonist would like to take a ride on the racetrack, and Lin ends up accepting his generous offer. Kim didn't like that the manager was bringing people there, since he had booked the entire place just for himself. But the manager soon clarifies to the young man that this was actually the sole owner of the place where they were. Lin asks the manager to get those outsiders out of there. After all, he felt like taking a few laps on the racetrack, and could even give him his money back if necessary, as no one had ever had the nerve to treat Kim this way. He suggests a race to our protagonist, saying that whoever won could stay at the place. After Lin ends up accepting his offer, he becomes curious to see what Lin's car is, saying he could even switch cars if necessary, if he thought his own car was too powerful. However, when he sees it was a Pagani Zonda, he is left completely speechless, and they finally get ready to race. But in the end, there wasn't much of a chance for Kim, as Lin ended up easily winning the race between them, thus earning the respect and admiration of the famous young man, who even asked to follow Lin on social media. Kim then asks for some advice on what he could have done to improve his start at the beginning of the race, and Lin gave him some information to improve a bit. Lin received a new ride request shortly after on his blah blah app, and he tells the manager that he had to leave so Kim could stay there, and it would be for free. The young man then asks what kind of job he had, since he was in such a hurry to leave, and upon saying he was a blah blah driver, he left the young man completely speechless to hear that. At the place where he was to pick up his ride, we see the divine lady who doesn't even. She had finished getting ready for her suitor, and let's just say he didn't care much for her. So he gets straight to the point and asks her to wait, and tells her to go play or do something else while she finishes preparing. When he sits down to use the computer, he says there was a new email for her, and she, thinking it was about some kind of business document or something, ended up letting it go. But upon realizing it was actually an item of clothing she had bought online earlier, she quickly comes back so he won't see it, although it was already too late. At one point, she ended up slipping and almost falling, and when he tries to help her so she won't get hurt, let's just say he ended up getting quite an eyeful, which caused red juice to flow from his nostrils due to the intense excitement. Utterly embarrassed, she leaves in a fluster and returns a short time later all dressed up, asking how she looked in that new outfit. If I could make a comment right now, it would be that her outfit showed her health was in perfect order. But since I can't say anything, I'll just stay silent. With that, Lin replies that her new outfit was suitable for beauty pageants, and even more suitable for doing the squats she owed him, then tells her not to worry, as he hadn't forgotten about the squats that she owed him, and asks her to close the curtains so she can settle her debt. And finally, the mood was perfectly set for the most educational physical activities anyone has ever seen. However, since I clearly can't show it here, we'll have to settle for just this scene of her getting ready. Although not much really happened, after she fulfilled her promise, she rushes him so they can go to an exchange that she had to attend, but let's just say he got a little too excited and had to quickly go to the bathroom. Half an hour later, he returns happy as a clam, completely relieved. I imagine some of you have already figured out why he decided to be gone for a while. After all, the view he had was enough to leave anyone speechless, if you know what I mean. Suddenly, as they were leaving, the Divine Lady's parents appear, and not wanting to interrupt the couple, her father asks if they were already done. However, she freaked out, asking what the old man was talking about. Her dad says he had arrived a long time ago, but since they saw the curtains were closed, he didn't dare to come in so as not to disturb them. And even her mother joined the conversation too, saying that she had no reason to be embarrassed, as it was a normal daily need. Before leaving and letting them go to their engagement, the lady's mother invites him to her grandfather's birthday party, which would take place 2 days later, and he ended up accepting her offer, while the Divine Lady was completely embarrassed in the background. When he finally takes Miss G to her engagement, he asks her not to forget to give him the 5-star rating, and tells her to book the return trip with him as well, saying he'd come running to pick her up. She, apparently, was a little jealous of him, and says that he probably always got good reviews from his female clients, and, let's just say, he couldn't help that from happening. Finally, they say their goodbyes, and he tells her to get in touch if she needs anything. After that, the girl dressed as a bunny from before was now dressed as a cheerleader, congratulating him for completing another task. And as a reward, this time he got 21% of the Blah Blah company's assets, now becoming one of the executive directors of Blah Blah, just for making a few deliveries. Then, he was told that the location of the headquarters of Blah Blah had an estimated value of $500 million, and if he sold his stake in the company, he could easily make a profit of at least $10 billion. However, since he's smart, he decided to keep his shares and earn a few $100 million in dividends each year. Seeing that he had completed 55% of his career, and that he could receive an even more generous reward when he reached 100%, he became even more excited to move forward with his life as a Blah Blah driver. Or at least that's what he thought, as he would soon have to deal with a customer who would drive him crazy. Parking the car next to her, he asks if she was the person he had come to pick up, and she answers yes, thinking that she had dressed so well that even the rich guy had taken an interest in her. Once inside the car, she asks where he would like to take her, saying that she wasn't a very easy person to please, and he asks her if she wasn't the one who placed the order on Blah Blah. She outraged that he was an app driver, didn't believe his words, and he says that this was actually the company's new service, a luxury version, so to speak. Her disappointment was so great that she ended up showing her true colors, thinking she had really found a rich man. During the ride, she ended up getting on our protagonist's last nerve, and to get his revenge, he put her through some rather complicated and embarrassing situations, I'd say, and he tells her to get out of his car. As if tormenting his life before wasn't enough, she also says she would leave a bad review on the app and that she would also call to complain about him. After leaving there, he gets a call from the regional agent of Blah Blah, who chews him out for acting that way with a customer, saying that it would be deducted from his deposit if it happened again. Then, Lin retorts that he could deduct it if he wanted to, and the agent didn't like Lin's response. He says he would suspend his operating license. When Lin asks if he had ever stopped to think about the consequences of suspending his license, it was checkmate, and the agent simply told Lin to wait for the suspension, hanging up the phone on him in the rudest way possible. After that, Lin had gone to visit his villas in Kyushu, or at least I think that's what happened, and he was very well received upon his arrival. At one point, the young man attending to him said he had hired some housekeepers and would like to introduce them, and Lin decides to go with him to where they were. However, upon arriving there, let's just say he finds the very same girl from before, the one who thought she was in the center of the universe. The manager then, seeing the way she treated Lin, reprimands his employee. With that, Lin asks why she was there, and if it was to work as a maid or something. Then, she replies rudely, saying it was none of his business and that a Blah Blah driver should never be there. With this arrogant Ati, how dare she speak to the owner of the Kyushu estate that way? Apparently, the manager was her cousin and still, she insisted there was no way he could own the place, since he was just an employee of Blah Blah. The manager then tells her to apologize to Lin, and only then did she realize that he was actually the owner of the place. And with that, she finally decides to set aside her pride and apologizes to him, asking for another chance. However, it was already too late, and Lin says she had horrible breath, so Lin asked the security guards to get her out of there, and they clearly did. After getting rid of society's undesirables, the manager finally introduces the 4 housekeepers he had prepared for Lin. Seeing they didn't look very happy, Lin tells them they can all go back, and he would reimburse 5,000 to each of them for travel expenses. After that, he receives a message from the Divine Lady, who was now ready to be picked up. He finally leaves after asking his manager to find more domestic employees for him. At the place where the Divine Lady was, her friend was asking her not to leave yet and to stay for a second round, and a young man named Jim asked her the same thing, also saying that he would take her home later. But since Miss D was very busy with work, she had to leave and had already asked her driver to pick her up as well. And speaking of him, he finally arrives at the establishment to pick up his beautiful lady. But apparently the young man didn't like seeing this scene very much. While Gray was fuming inside, his friend was saying that Lin was very handsome and could even be. With that, the spoiled and carefree kid says that there was no point in being handsome, since he was just a driver for blah blah. And then his friend asks what was wrong with that. The young man says he figured Lin was just very lucky to meet Miss D. Then, the young man says his friend wasn't very smart, since even though Lin was a driver, he still had a sense of superiority. And since the girl with him didn't like what he just said, the young man defends himself by saying that he truly needed to have that sense of superiority. The girl accompanying the young man then says that her companion had bought a Mercedes, and the protagonist could never in his life save up money to buy a car like that. After this embarrassing scene, the Divine Lady tells him not to pay them much attention, as they had drunk too much, and asks him for them to leave immediately, leaving the brat completely outraged because she had defended Lin right in front of him. In the parking lot, the brat was showing off his little car, bragging way too much, even saying that he would buy a Lamborghini when he got rich. The Divine Lady comments that she remembered that his favorite car in college was a Pagani Zonda, and he says that for the price of a Pagani, even if he worked his entire life, he could never buy one. Just then, speaking of the Pagani, his friend notices that there was one parked right next to his car, and he goes to see the car of his dreams, which is right in front of him. After a while, our protagonist asks if he was done looking, and the guy thought that he actually wanted to see it too. However, when our protagonist asks his Divine Lady to get in his car, they were left with their mouths wide open, especially upon realizing that this beautiful car actually belonged to a simple driver for blah blah, and he finally leaves the presence of toxic people with his beautiful lady. Inside the car, Mrs. G apologizes to him for her colleagues, as she didn't imagine they would be so snobby, but he didn't mind much and asked if she'd like him to take her home. However, since she had had a little to drink, she wanted to go to the beach to clear her head, even offering to change the destination, but he let it go, since it wouldn't hurt to change the route to get some fresh air. His new task was to get 10 5-star reviews, and with this one, it would be his 7th positive review, and they finally arrive at the beach. Then she asked him to turn around into the other side so she could take off her stockings, but he thought she was going to do something else. However, let's just say that at first he refused to turn away, and she was forced to pinch him to stop him from looking. My friends, I don't think I need to comment on this image, a beauty unparalleled in manhwas. Honestly, I think this was the character, most beautiful one I've seen so far. Finally, she went over to where he was, ready for them to go for a walk on the beach, and she mentions that her parents kept insisting she go to her grandfather's birthday when he was about to ask something. He had already anticipated her question and asks if she'd like him to pretend to be her boyfriend, and, right after, he agrees, saying he could take care of that for her, since she had worked so hard on the squats earlier. When she saw the lights of the Kyushu pavilion on, she was quite impressed, since due to its extremely high price, the pavilion had never been sold before. Therefore, it was the first time she had seen it all lit up at night. He said he would drive a little closer to show her the place, and even said that if she liked it, she could sleep there if she wanted. We continue with Mrs. G, thinking it would be a dream to sleep in the Kyushu residence, and with that, the protagonist decided to show her a few more things. Upon arriving at the entrance, she mentions that she participated in the bidding for that land at the beginning, although the result was later nullified. Anyway, since she was also the president of a company, he said she didn't need to feel envious, but she tries to play it cool by saying that the indoor pool used mineral water flown in by plane, and because of that, she was actually just curious. Lin takes her by the hand, saying he would show her what it was like inside, so, since she wanted to see, afraid of being caught, she settled for just watching from the outside, but the protagonist asks her what he would gain if he actually managed to get her inside. She says she would put on a bikini and put on a great show for him, which, honestly, only increased his motivation even more to get his reward. They enter the Kyushu pavilion, Amazed at how easy it was to get in, she even wondered where the place's security was, since it was supposed to have the highest level of security around. Upon entering, she notices a fruit tree nearby, and, to get even closer to her, he asks if she'd like to pick some fruit, but she gently refuses. When she sees the pool, she is impressed by its beauty, and, since they managed to see the pool, it was time for Mrs. G to fulfill her promise. Or at least it would be if she had a bikini with her and knew how to swim too. Therefore, it was better for them to talk about it later. With no options to refuse, he ended up agreeing to what she said, and she says that she would keep her word and they would return there so she could repay him in a moment. He asks if she wouldn't want to take a look inside the house, but since she was already afraid of being caught, she thought it was better to stay there. But since there was no one in the villa, he tells her not to be afraid and to come inside. After that, her surprise was enormous when he knocked on the door and was welcomed into his home, only then revealing that the house was actually his, all along, which only made her scold him for having tricked her this whole time. While admiring the interior of the house, she asked how much he had spent there, and he replies that he had spent a few billion. Thinking he was trying to trick her again, she says that the most expensive villa there only cost 1.2 billion, unless he had bought the entire Kyushu pavilion, and he finally reveals that he had, in fact, bought it. Since she had never seen anything like it before, she asks if by any chance he had some kind of money tree, but since he couldn't reveal anything about the system he had, he decided to remain silent, although it was easier than having a real money tree. Now more at ease, she decides to sit on the comfortable and luxurious sofa of the residence. With that, he says that he wouldn't take her home so late at night. Therefore, she could choose one of the rooms to stay in, and ends up accepting the protagonist's generous offer. When she asks if he had women's pajamas there, he obviously answers no, because it wouldn't make much sense if he did. However, he says he wouldn't look so she could sleep however she felt most comfortable, which ended up making her feel even more embarrassed. He decided to go upstairs to see if he had any pajamas for her, and while she was in the shower, she ended up slipping and asked him to come in for a moment because she had fallen. Worried about her, he asks if Mrs. G had gotten hurt, and asks for his help to take a shower. Since the protagonist doesn't beat around the bush, I imagine you've already figured out what kind of support he gave her. To be honest, I think he's really stepped in it now, if you know what I mean. The next morning, she wakes him up in a hurry, since she would be late if he decides to sleep in, and she says that if he got up early and took her to work, she would give him 5 stars. After dropping off Miss G, Lin remembers that he hadn't eaten anything yet, so he decided to take a breakfast break. He had clearly gone to the place he owned, but since he didn't want to cause a scene, he tells his general manager that he would be there discreetly without revealing to the employees who he really was. As soon as he walks in, he calls a waitress over to serve him, and to his surprise, the waitress who came to serve him was precisely the manager who had fired him in Chapter 1. Then, she starts humiliating the protagonist again, saying she never thought she'd find scum like him there. Outraged by her treatment of him, he starts to argue with her, and, once again, she begins to humiliate him by saying that if it weren't for his relationship with a rich woman, he could never afford to eat there. Soon, one of the employees says that she'd better stop saying those things, but the former manager completely ignored the girl's warning and continued, saying things she shouldn't. To prevent the situation from getting worse, Lin tells an employee to go get the general manager, but the new manager continued to humiliate him non-stop, eventually asking if he couldn't learn from his own mistake, saying that out of respect for him as a former colleague, she would let his error slide this one time. Then, the general manager arrives, and she tells him to call security to throw Lin out because he was poor and trying to cause trouble. However, the one who got reprimanded this time was her, and the manager says that he was the owner of that place. Therefore, if anyone should be kicked out, it should be her. Since she still didn't believe what the manager had told her, she says that he must have been tricked somehow, since Lin was her former co-worker. But, apparently, the one who had tricked someone there was her, and he wonders how a person like her managed to pass her interview. As if that wasn't enough, the manager says he would also blacklist her, which would completely end her career, since no company would hire her anymore after this whole spectacle. The security guards dragged her away, apologizing to Lin for their actions. After resolving the issue with the woman, the bitter woman, the general manager apologizes for the inconvenience with his boss's meal, and the protagonist gladly accepts, only asking him to do a more thorough screening the next time he hires someone. After that, he receives a call from an unknown number, and, upon answering, he finds it's the senior vice president of blah blah, named Tian Yang. She would like to get to know him better, so she asked him when he might have time to talk. However, since he had a job in the morning, he said he would contact her later, and, With that, she agrees to speak with him later. When her assistant asks if Lin had accepted to meet with her, the vice president repeats what he said. Therefore, she was going to visit one of her colleagues in that morning. Hearing her superior's plans, her assistant decides to call a driver to take them to the location. To her surprise, little did she know that this driver would be the very person she had been looking for all this time. Then, he receives a ride request on his app, and, naturally, he decides to accept it, since they were very close by. When he gets there, he meets the vice president and her assistant, and asks if she is the Miss Tian who requested the ride. She replies that she is, but in her mind, she was clearly admiring our protagonist's good looks. When Lin tells her to get in his car, she was shocked that he was the blah blah driver, and even the assistant was wondering when their company had gotten so impressive. Since he didn't have much time, he asks the beautiful lady to get into his car. As soon as she gets in, she asks if he was just doing this to enjoy life, and says that many girls must find this whole thing interesting, to say the least. He then asks if there was a company rule stating he couldn't be a driver with a supercar, and she says that he could, but he had to be careful about what he said and did. After all, he could end up being suspended for defaming the company. When he asks if she really has that much power to suspend his license at any moment, she finally reveals herself as the senior president of blah blah. Apparently, he hadn't fully believed what she said and reveals that he is a shareholder of blah blah. Soon, she decides to show her vice president card, proving that she really held that position, and he says that he hadn't lied to her either, because the day before, he had bought 28% of her company's shares, and she had called him a little while ago, saying she wanted to meet with him, and only then did she realize that he was Lin. Then, she apologizes for having offended him in any way, asking him to give her the chance to sit down and talk with him when the trip is over. He says that he needed to finish a few trips first, which makes her ask him to get in touch when he is finally free. At the end of his trip, she was unable to make the payment to the protagonist, and only then did he receive a message on his cell phone, saying that because he had violated one of the company's regulations, his license had been suspended. That's how he realized that it was possibly the guy who had called him earlier who had processed this suspension. The place he had taken Mrs. Tian was precisely the company that had just suspended his license, while she was thinking that they were offending one of the main shareholders of her company. The protagonist thought it had been the complainer who had called to complain to the platform again. Tian then told him not to worry, as she would take care of that matter soon, and his license would be back shortly, but he ended up deciding to go with her to personally investigate the situation. Without a second thought, they burst into the meeting room, and he soon reveals who he was, saying that his license had been suspended, and he was there to talk to him. The president then passes the responsibility to the operations manager, who soon starts saying that he was a very arrogant young man for having the nerve to show up there after acting that way, also saying that he had called security on him. Tired of listening to nonsense, the protagonist decided to sit down and yield the floor to Mrs. Tian, who soon said that the suspension would be lifted and that the manager should have at least investigated better before suspending him. Thus, as vice president of blah blah, she was removing him from the position of operations manager of that company. Only when she showed her ID card did they really believe that she was, in fact, the vice president. The operations manager starts to explain himself, trying to find an excuse to justify his action and blocking the protagonist's license, which made her ask if he had at least investigated the passenger he had supposedly insulted. Furthermore, Lin had just bought 21% of blah blah's shares, becoming the company's second largest shareholder. Therefore, she didn't believe he would insult a passenger. Then, they said he was just a blah blah driver, not believing that was really true. However, Tian soon tells them to shut up, since Lin was in the process of getting to know their company better when they blocked his license. After all this confusion, she decided to cancel their operating company's status, which caused the president to tell her manager to apologize to Lin, and so he did, apologizing for his previous attitude. However, the protagonist ended up rejecting his apology, since, based on his recent actions, it seemed that over the years many had been bullied by him. Therefore, as a shareholder of blah blah, he approved of Tian's decision, and their operator was disqualified. Soon, he receives a call from Mrs. Yi and asks the vice president to take care of it, and from the others, since he needed to take that call. When he answered, she said that the next day would be her grandfather's birthday, so they would go out to buy clothes for her and for him too, and he agreed, saying he would pick her up in the afternoon. With that, he thought that he couldn't go empty-handed to her grandfather's birthday and wondered what the old man would like to receive. Then the vice president returned, saying that his license had been unblocked again, and that he had also received maximum access. Since he hadn't had this access before, he asked if drivers have different permissions, and she said it was just a few more auxiliary functions. However, one of these functions was precisely to allow users to make a request by searching for his license plate number and specify the request they would like to make. From the way he reacted to this, he found this type of function very useful, and then said he had a birthday to go to, so he asked if she knew a good place that sold antique paintings. She then asked if a painting by Sandakian was good enough for him, which ended up surprising him that she had access to that painting. I don't really know what kind of painting it is or who it's by either, but that doesn't make much of a difference to us. Then she said that her president managed to get a copy of that painting, and if he wanted it, she would send her assistant to pick it up immediately. He then gladly accepted her painting and asked how much it would cost, but she couldn't accept money from him, as he was their second largest shareholder. He asked them to send the painting to the manager of the Peninsula Hotel. Since Lin didn't like to owe favors, he said he would give her 1% of his assets in exchange for this painting to be even. Clearly, she was surprised by his generosity, as just 1% of his assets was equivalent to about 500 million yuan, which was their currency. After that, he said goodbye, saying that she could continue operating in the same way she was, and that he would not interfere with her work. Then, she said that her president would like to invite him to visit them in Yanshan, and the protagonist replied that he would go soon, so he would contact her when the time came, thinking that a long time had passed, since he had last visited the orphanage there, and that he needed to find time to pay another visit. At the end of this ride, he finally received another 5-star review and got a new ride request on his app to take the person to his exact hotel. At this moment, we see a young woman who would soon be a headache for him, named Yang Chanshin. As soon as he stopped the Pagani next to her, she asked who he was, and he replied that he was the blah-blah driver she had requested. As soon as she got into the beautiful Pagani, she mentioned that his company was very clever for having thought of such an original marketing technique. However, he said that the car was really his and that it wasn't their idea, but apparently she didn't believe what he said, thinking that he believed she was a naive girl who had yet to see the world. Realizing that she would be a real problem for him, he decided to ignore her comments and finish the ride quickly. With that, he decided to take a small detour, but she ended up thinking he had done it just so she would pay more in the end. Although shortly after he said that he frequented that place often and that's why he knew a shortcut to get there faster. However, the annoying girl thought again that he had done it just to increase the fare, the value of the ride, so she would pay more for it at the end of the trip. As soon as he parks his Pagani in front of the hotel, he realizes that she probably had something going on with one of its employees, since she didn't even want to go in through the main entrance. And it isn't long before he receives a 1-star review from her. Since he didn't want to get too stressed out about it, he decided to go pick up Miss Guy and soon manages to meet up with her. But he was already reminding her that she still hadn't left the 5-star review after they finished the trip, and she then says that it would depend on his performance on that specific day. With that, he ended up acting even better with her, even offering to carry the bag she had. When they arrive in front of a bikini shop, she decides to stop there to buy one, and he tells her that after buying it, she could fulfill her promise made the day they were at his pavilion, and she replies that she wouldn't have made that promise if she had known that he was actually the owner of the place. However, since he hadn't forced her to do anything, she would now have to face the consequences. It wasn't long before an assistant came to attend to them, and in the end, she told them they were done shopping there. Surprised by her attitude, he asks her why she hadn't bought anything for herself, and the divine lady replies that none of it fits her well, so he should just get on with it and they should leave. But when she decided not to buy anything, the assistant then says that they had sizes from A to D, but since the lady wore a size E, they didn't have anything in her size. With this comment, she ended up embarrassing the divine lady, who says that if they didn't have it there, they just had to go to the other store next door, since they would probably have something in her size there. Upon arriving, they are impressed with the outfit that was in the window, or at least he was. As that outfit was something out of the ordinary, she pulls him away completely, embarrassed, so that they can finally do their shopping. As soon as they enter, she asks the saleswoman where their bikinis were, and it isn't long before the lady was taken to the latest models they had. As she had never worn anything like that before, it seems she was a little embarrassed by those models, and in the end, she ended up bringing a more conservative model for Lin to give his opinion as well. And the protagonist's opinion was precisely that this model wouldn't be enough to show the true strength she had. With that, he gave her the idea of wearing a model a little more appropriate for the divine lady. And with much tenderness in her heart, and also embarrassment, she ends up accepting. He then asks the clerk to get that model in a size E, but he decided to also get the one she had liked before. When she says that she thought he hadn't liked that model, he replies that he actually liked it a lot, but the model she liked was for her to use when going out and having fun, while the one he showed her first was for her to wear, only in front of him, and you could already see from her little face that she was enjoying all of this. After that, she decides to go to the 4th floor to buy some custom-made dresses this time. From the beginning, she was fascinated with one of the dresses that was on display, and while the protagonist waited for his divine lady, she soon appears, asking him to go to the fitting room where she was. When he says that it wouldn't make a good impression if he came in, she replies that she only asked him to help her adjust the zipper on the back. After all, she couldn't do it herself, and with an additional comment on this scene, I think our protagonist is a little hesitant about what he really should have done in that moment, as the view was absolutely breathtaking. When he asks if she wasn't showing too much, she said she had a shawl to cover her back. However, he still doubted that it was really a size E, since it looked more like a size F, which ended up embarrassing her with the comment he had just made. When she finally finishes getting dressed, he says that the dress looked great on her. So, since she liked it, she decided to keep it, while the saleswoman said she felt that dress was made for her. Another customer arrives with her companion in the background. Soon, the gold digger, whom we'll call Sansuga here, told her partner that she would also like a dress like that, and so, he asked the assistant to bring the same dress for her. But since that was the only piece they had, because it was custom-made, she could look at other styles. But the guy ended up being arrogant and says that from the looks of the protagonist and the divine lady, they wouldn't be able to afford that dress. Therefore, he would take it instead. But soon the annoyed divine lady appears with the comment the strange man had just made. Sansuga then asks if she could really afford the price of that outfit, since it cost more than 80,000, and the beautiful divine lady replies that she could certainly afford it herself, unlike her, leaving the girl completely outraged by her response. Although the divine lady hadn't told a lie, since the girl was really just taking money from the guy. Soon, the simp says he would add 20,000 to her commission if she sold him that dress, but that was not in accordance with the establishment's rules, so the protagonist would add 200,000. Besides, if you looked at the size of the dress, it wouldn't fit his companion. After all, the girl looked like a plank compared to the divine lady, and, in the end, he ended up giving up on buying that dress, especially when he saw that he would just be spending money for nothing. For having defended the beautiful lady, she said he would receive a great reward later. This time it was his turn to try on a suit for the party, and the girls in the background were completely charmed by him, even thinking it was a shame he wasn't a gigolo. When he asks what the divine lady thought, she replies that it was fine already, because she was afraid the young women would get lightheaded if he decided to try on a few more outfits, and after that, they finally decide to leave, although he was eager to finally receive his reward. Later, at his residence in the pavilion, Lin was enjoying the beautiful sun shining down on him, until suddenly an even better view appeared before him, completely brightening his day, his night, and the rest of the year as well. Apparently, it wasn't just him who was enchanted, as the beautiful lady was also impressed with his appearance. Noticing that she was staring at him a lot, he asks if she liked what she saw, and she replies, clearly embarrassed, trying to hide her gaze. She mentions that, so he doesn't waste any time, and says that he loved people like her, who keep their word. After that, he invites her to swim, but at first, she ended up grabbing him, asking him not to let her go, because she didn't know how to swim. He reassures her, saying he wouldn't let her go, and asks if she would like him to teach her how to swim, and, apparently, the divine lady ended up accepting his proposal, but since she was afraid of drowning, she asked him not to let go of her in the water. The swimming lessons would soon begin, but he says he couldn't move if she kept squeezing him like that. After relaxing a bit, she finally feels calmer. So they could start the lessons, and, just when she thought she was doing great, she ended up panicking in the middle of swimming, causing her to sink. However, being a man of his word, he kept his promise and went after her to save her, and, let's just say he passed some of his air to her so she could breathe underwater. And, my friends, what a beautiful scene we have here. I think this alone is enough to say the manhwa is worth reading. When he asks if she was scared, she replies that with him around it didn't seem so frightening, and after that he gives the lady divine a big hug, which I clearly don't need to say what happened next, right? Later, while she was bathing, he asked to use her cell phone, and she gave him the password so he could use it. While he was on the divine lady's cell phone, he received a visit from the system girl again, who said he had already managed to complete 75% of his career. Therefore, His reward was a jump year. Basically, this was the second largest cruise terminal. Since he had already completed a good part of his career, he wasn't far from unlocking his next profession and thinks that if he continued at this pace, he could unlock the next profession before the previously scheduled deadline. Soon, the beautiful deity appears, saying that because of him she hadn't been able to learn to swim, but since this was his house, she could come over whenever she wanted, and next time, he would really teach her how to do it. Now, we see an old quilt, and he says it was because he came from the orphanage, so he was used to them, and that's why he didn't want to throw them away. After this revelation, she asks if he was an orphan, and he says that, according to Agmar, when he was born, he was taken to an orphanage, and that's where he grew up. She soon apologizes for making him remember something so painful, but he didn't mind much. When he was a child, this person named Agmar took care of him and treated him as if he were her son, and he had many friends by his side, so it seemed he had a lot of fun as a child. Then, she said she was going to bed, and if he could get up early and take her to work, they could go out later and go to her grandfather's birthday party in the afternoon. And he ends up agreeing, as he would love to take her to work every day so he could complete his mission faster too. We continue with our protagonist receiving a sudden call on his mobile phone, and when he answers, it was precisely Agmar, the woman who had raised him. She mentions that she found out he had broken up with his ex-girlfriend and ends up recommending a girl he could meet. After all, she was practically the same age as him. Out of respect for her, perhaps he ended up agreeing to meet the girl, and she had arranged a meeting for them the next morning. When it was time for the meeting, he was there to talk to the girl Agmar had recommended, and he quickly manages to find the girl and her family. Soon, a woman greets him, and this was the mother of the girl he had gone to meet. She mentions that she found out he worked at a real estate agency, but when he said he had been fired, the reaction of the bloodsuckers there already showed a slight disdain for Lin, thinking he was unemployed. He says he was a rideshare driver who could barely pay his bills, which only made their contempt grow even more. Soon, she starts praising her daughter and her qualities and already demands that he buy an apartment in Chongqing. The girl then starts thinking she's the best thing in the world, saying it was no big deal if he really wanted her, and our protagonist ended up deciding to play along. One of the relatives says he would have to pay a bride price of 88 million, just for good luck. When he thinks this is an exaggeration, the girl's mother mentions that a colleague of her daughter had received a bride price of 1,600,000. When he mentions that she was practically selling her daughter, apparently she didn't like his comment very much, but he tells her to continue with the robbery. Now it was her brother's turn to ask for something, and it was precisely an imported car worth more than 500,000, cheap according to him. The total sum of everything would be almost 10 million, and Lin asks if they really think he could get all that money. When the girl's mother comments that young people could get married without depending on their family, he gives her a threatening look, saying that his parents were dead. Her brother had heard that the orphanage would be relocated, and when the land was sold, he would receive a portion of that value. Finally, after they show their true colors, Lin throws the hot tea he was drinking on the scum of society, thus revealing that he was just messing with them. But in the end, they just wanted to use the money he would receive. As Lin was leaving, the parasite's mother was worried about her parasitic son, who said he wouldn't forgive our protagonist. It doesn't take him long to grab a flower pot to throw at Lin, but he missed by a very small margin. The protagonist then says that the consequences of his actions today could be very serious, especially because, although the flower pot didn't hit him, the spoiled brat managed to scratch his car, leaving them so scared they could barely breathe. When the insolent brat starts admiring the Pagani he had, Lin responds by telling him the value of the car and the 2 million cost for the repaint, also asking them how they would pay. The woman's attitude changed completely upon seeing the car he had, but Lin was not impressed by her sudden interest. He gave them an ultimatum, telling them to get the 2 million or they would receive a court summons. When he leaves, the snake's mother starts fighting with her daughter, blaming her for his departure, and even the spoiled brat starts blaming her, as if he hadn't done anything. Then, Lin decided to visit his newly acquired colleague, and he runs into the operations manager, who was being tricked by a girl who didn't want to pay for the damage she had done to one of the boats, or rather, she wanted to pay in another way, if you could deduce that from this image. The protagonist, seeing this, asks if he would really let her go without paying for the damages. Obviously, the manager ended up being very rude to Lin, and he replies that, since he was the manager, if she didn't pay, the money would come out of his pocket and he finally leaves. Shortly after, he arrives at the place to talk to the employees and introduce himself as the new owner of the place as well. And finally, the receptionist takes him to the meeting room. Upon arriving, the executives received him quite well, but it seemed the operations manager was missing, who was apparently busy with something else. Quickly, the boss there asks the receptionist to call in the manager as soon as possible, and 5 minutes later, the same guy from before arrives. When he sees that Lin was the new chairman of the company, he doesn't know where to hide his face, even apologizing and saying he would make it up to him by asking for another chance. But now it was too late, and he asks the general manager to get the fool out of there. After that, he tells his executives that he wanted to modernize the dock, but since they were already in second place, one of them didn't think this change was necessary. However, our protagonist wasn't happy with being in second place and, moreover, he would give them a raise as well, which ended up getting everyone there excited to work on improvements. Upon leaving the company, he receives a message from the manager of the Peninsula Hotel, saying that someone had delivered a painting to him. In addition, he receives a call saying that the watch he had ordered earlier was also ready for delivery. When he says he didn't have time and asks them to send it to the Kyushu Pavilion, they unfortunately couldn't do it due to the high value of the product. They could only deliver it exactly to the person who bought it, and he asks them to send it to the place where Miss G's grandfather's party would be during the evening. Finally, he goes to her grandfather's celebration, and the divine lady soon greets him, but let's just say she felt embarrassed by him, looking where he shouldn't. Upon entering the hall, people began to admire the couple's presence, and they finally reached the table where her grandfather was. Unfortunately for Lin, he ended up running into the annoying girl from before, saying that he was just a rideshare driver and claiming the protagonist had tried to fool her. Clearly, the divine lady didn't believe her words. And, apparently, the grandfather didn't like what he had just heard, even with Miss G trying to explain that the car really was his. The girl continued to say negative things about Lin, when one of the other girls says to let the girl in blue's boyfriend see if he's a liar or not. The snake then introduces her new admirer. Clearly, he decided to defend her by saying that Lin was just a rideshare driver. When the divine lady's father asks what was happening, she explains that Lin was not a fraud and her grandfather had just asked the security guards to remove him from there, until suddenly the delivery men arrive for the watch the protagonist had bought. Upon seeing the limited edition watch he had purchased, only then did the fool and the snake realize they were wrong about Lin. After that, the grandfather tells his granddaughter to apologize for the mistake she had made, but the snake's mother appeared to defend the scum of society. Hearing her aunt's words, the divine lady didn't stay silent, realizing she was just jealous of her boyfriend. Soon, the shameless couple gives their gift to the grandfather, and it was a collection of Qin dynasty coins valued at over 2 million. The divine lady then decides to take a gift out of her purse, saying that was the protagonist's gift for the grandfather, who ends up gladly receiving it, even though it was simple. However, Lin says that she didn't need to lie for him, and that he had really brought a gift for the family's grandfather. Apparently, even she didn't fully believe he had brought a gift, and soon she hands him the painting she had just received. The old man was amazed by the Sandakui artwork, and the price of that painting was at least 200 million. She didn't see anything special in the painting, openly wondering if it was worth the price. The old man simply stated that the painting had a meaning that was not visible to the common eye. The fool then says he was being deceived, since they offered 230 million for the same painting to his manager, and he didn't want to sell. The rattlesnake then starts to annoy the divine lady on purpose, but she was sure that Lin wouldn't deceive people with a fake painting. The scoundrel then decides to break that very expensive painting in front of everyone, claiming that the work was fake, also saying that this was a rule of the ancient world. The beautiful lady ended up outraged with him, but Lin soon comforts her, saying he would take care of it. The protagonist says that the simpleton's qualification to operate had just been revoked, but apparently he didn't fully believe his words. Only then does he reveal that he owns 20% of the shares of blah blah and had the right to remove him from the company. Even the divine lady said that now was not the time to joke and asks if he really had those shares, and she would reward him later, leaving Miss G completely embarrassed. After that, he tells the wretched man to call his manager to ask if he knew any Lin, and so he did, saying he would even put the phone on speaker so that the protagonist's lies would be exposed. When the manager answers the phone, she tells the fool to welcome Mr. Lin. Alright. When he mentions that Lin had said he only had 20% of the shares, she says it was because she had given the painting, Chandachi, to Lin, and since he didn't want to take advantage of her, he gave her 0.1% of the shares. With that, the human scum ended up on the floor, realizing the huge mistake he had just made. And as the second largest shareholder, Lin took away the simpleton's operating qualifications. The snake says she didn't need to go too far, since it was her grandfather's birthday. Even the rattlesnake's mother joins the conversation, saying he had no consideration for the family. He simply replies that if it had been the divine lady who had asked, he would have done it immediately. But since it was a simple disposable being like her, he had no reason to do it for the grandfather's sake. He didn't even want the protagonist to feel pity at that moment. Then he asks how the flatterer would compensate for the 200 million painting he had just broken, and he soon starts begging for another chance. The fool even ran to the rattlesnake asking for help, but here she ended up saying that they no longer had anything to do with each other. The scoundrel, afraid of what would happen now, even clings to her begging her not to abandon him, and Lin, seeing that, says it wasn't worth humiliating himself for a woman like that. After that, the protagonist tells Miss G's father to gather the family because he had something to tell everyone in the living room. The grandfather asks what mystery he was hiding, and even the rattlesnake asked him to just say what he wanted, and so he did, saying that she was meeting with 2 people at the hotel he owned, plus he had some videos on his phone to prove what she was really doing there. Upon showing the proof to the grandfather, he quickly became outraged by his granddaughter's shamelessness. She even tries to explain, saying she had only gone to talk business, but she gets a good slap. Afterwards, the rattlesnake's mother tries to defend her daughter again, but this time she ended up getting a scolding from Miss G's father. And finally, Lin decides to leave with the divine lady. Since they had a lot to talk about outside, she thanks him, and he just asks her to make more ride requests to compensate him. But she ended up thinking he would ask for something more difficult, showing us a somewhat disappointed face. Since there would be no more birthday banquet, he decided to accept a few more rides to finish his mission. Quickly, we now see a beautiful teenage girl who was apparently being bothered by a guy interested in her. But since she wasn't interested in going with him, she said the ride she just called would be there soon. It didn't take long and, soon, the protagonist pulls his car up in front of her, asking if she was the young lady who had made the request on the BlaBla app. When she responds yes, he asks her to get in, as he was the driver she had been waiting for. And so she did, leaving the guy who was interested in her with his face in the dirt. Inside the car, she asked why he still did rides if he had a beautiful car. And he simply replied that the car didn't matter. What was important was earning money for oneself. Upon arriving at her destination, she asked to add him on the neighboring social network, and he asked why she wanted to add him there. When she asked him if he believed in, he said she was very naive, especially since he could clearly be a bad boy, so it was better for her to be more careful. And when she got out of the car, he thought that girls nowadays were too gullible. He then received a call from the girl who had tried to get money from him before, asking him to pick her up the next day. Lin then asked if she had already gotten the 2 million to repair her car and that she would go to get the money the next day. She then told him to stop with those jokes and that the other day they were just testing him, and since he had passed the family test, he and she were now a couple. Apparently, he didn't like much about the things this girl had in mind, and he responded rudely, saying that if they didn't pay the compensation for scratching his car, they would receive a court summons. We see that the girl he had gone to pick up was precisely the streamer from the other video. She was going to the international circuit, which he also owned. An official event would take place there, and she was going to try to do a live stream there. While they were heading to the circuit, he thought, live there. As they headed to the circuit, it occurred to him, while he was driving and, of course, he liked that. Upon arriving there, he also became curious to see the reason for all the commotion and decided to go in with her as well. As soon as they enter, they already find 2 rival streamers having a confrontation. Miss Yu decided to ask what was happening. The young man replies that the girl in front of him was trying to get rid of him and Yu, but according to her, it was the owner of the racetrack who said that only one host was needed. Since the racetrack was very large, all of them could stream peacefully. But still, that wasn't enough for her, and really wanted them to leave. Then, a person arrives saying that everything was ready, asking her rivals to leave, as they didn't have much to do now. Unfortunately, that was the only option they had at that moment. But Lin soon arrives taking charge, saying that they could stay there to stream. Outraged by the protagonist, the girl from before tells him to forget it, and that if he dared to mess with Kim Chow, he would lose his life without even knowing it. Lin decided to challenge her, telling her to go call Kim if he was man enough. Then Yu tries to calm the protagonist down, telling him they wouldn't stream there anymore, so he didn't need to get angry, but he gently refuses her offer to calm down, saying he would make sure the 2 of them would do the live stream there. When the young man asks who he was, she didn't really know how to answer either, but she still believed she could trust him no matter what he did. The young man also decided to trust his friend's instincts and go with Lin. Upon arriving there, we see several luxury cars parked and ready to race, and both streamers from before were impressed with the perfection of those machines. After that, Lin says that with him there, no one could kick them out, and it isn't long before Kim Chow and the manager arrive along with the girl from before. She then plays the victim and tries to get Kim to kick them out of the place. Quickly, the manager greets him very warmly. When she sees that even Kim knew the guy she thought was a nobody, she asks if he knew that person, who in this case is our protagonist. He then rudely replies to the girl, saying that he was the owner of the Shungi circuit. Lin then asks if she was his friend, since she had been very rude to him a while ago, but Kim replies that she's a nobody, and that he was going to kick her out right then. She then begs him not to kick her out, as her career would be over if he did, but since he knew Lin's character well, he knew that if she didn't yield, he would never kick her out. And after that she was taken out by the security guards. Kim asks if that girl was his new partner, and also if Lin wouldn't like him to get him some foreign girls. However, he ended up leaving all that fun just for Kim, leaving the streamers stunned by the way he treated even Kim, thinking that the protagonist was very powerful in some way. After that, the young man suggests that they race on that new track, and he ended up accepting. Before starting the race, Kim suggested they make a bet to make things more interesting. Basically, they would have to pay a difference of 100,000 per second at the end of the race, and Lin once again agrees to bet with him. They soon start racing, but there still wasn't much of a chance for young Kim, as the protagonist won against him once again. In the end, the young man pays 2 million with a heavy heart, already tired of losing to him. With that, the protagonist asked the manager to take that money and repaint his car for the previous scratch, and also asked the streamers to continue broadcasting as well, since he needed to leave soon to do the rides, and the beautiful Yu thanks him for his help. Kim then asks what he was doing, since he had a beautiful streamer right in front of him, but still wanted to continue with the rides. And Lin asks if he wanted to participate too, but the young man ended up politely declining his offer. Leaving the racetrack, he realizes that there were only 3 more requests left and he could finish that mission. After this, Lin decided to visit his aunt, to eat the food she prepared. She, surprised by his visit, says that she had to pick up her daughter from school, but still asks what he would like to eat and that she would quickly prepare something for him. He replied that he would pick up her daughter for her and that she could take her time making the food. Upon arriving at the place, he ended up waiting for 20 minutes and there was still no sign of the girl coming out, until he asks a little girl if the students were still in school. However, it seems that everyone had already been dismissed. He then decides to go inside and soon finds a small commotion in her classroom. He notices the presence of a beautiful teacher and, if I'm not mistaken, it seems he knows her from somewhere. Furthermore, the mother of one of the students was putting on a beautiful, cringeworthy spectacle, all this just because the young girl had hit her son's face, but it was he who had mistreated the little girl first. Otherwise, she wouldn't have done it. She wouldn't even have the chance to enter the entertainment industry she wanted to. From the beautiful teacher's reaction, she seems to know the protagonist too, and he asks what had happened for her to be, well, stuck there until this hour. The girl then, but the snake still says that if they weren't paid compensation today, this wouldn't end well, with the girl almost crying, says that it was the young boy who bullied her first, and the cobra retorted by saying that she had to endure it in silence for being poor. This arrogant attitude made Lin lose his patience and he pulls a Will Smith and gives the rattlesnake a good slap. Outraged by his attitude, she even comments on how he dared to hit her, but you could already see who that insignificant brat took after. The old hag then decided to offend the girl's teacher this time, saying she would resort to her husband to resolve this situation. With that, the beautiful teacher responds by saying it was all her son's fault and that even if she went to court, it would be useless. The disgusting old woman, still wanting to be right, threatened the entire school this time, but the teacher still says they could leave and that she would handle the current situation. However, before they could leave, the spoiled brat's father arrived and the baby told his dad who it was that hit his rattlesnake of a mother. Now it was the old man's turn to throw his weight around, saying that his boss was Kim Jong and that if he messed with him, there would be no way for Lin to live in Songhai anymore. Realizing who the guy's boss was, Lin decided to call Kim, asking him who the manager of his company was, that he wanted him to kneel even after winning the bet. Kim even thought Lin was joking, but we recently saw that all of this was true. Then he told the protagonist that he would find out who the idiot was that was doing this and would certainly give him an explanation. The guy from before asks who he had called. When he answers that it was precisely Kim Jong, he didn't believe what the protagonist said and, what's more, he even thought Lin had made it all up, until suddenly his cell phone rings and, upon answering, it was precisely Kim, who asked how he dared to provoke Lin. and orders him to take all his things and get out of that company immediately. After that, his tough guy act completely crumbled, and he says he would apologize to Lin immediately. At that moment, the guy was completely stunned, since he had just taken out a loan to buy a house and a car. The rattlesnake then asks what happened for him to be on his knees on the floor, and he replies, saying that Kim himself just fired him. After that, he begged Lin to give him another chance, asking him not to let Kim fire him, but the protagonist said nothing about it and simply kicked that bastard. It was lucky that he had gone to pick her up instead of her mother. Otherwise, who knows how much they would have been bullied by them, and he tells them to get out of there and become better people. Upon arriving at the place, the young girl was about to tell them what had happened at school and how Lin had acted, but he gently asked the little one not to say anything about it. She understood that this would be just their secret. We continue with Lin going to visit the Divine Lady at her workplace. Upon arriving there, he realizes that, even late at night, she was the only one still working overtime. Even though she was in danger, when he sees her eating her cookies, I confess that I found this little glutton too cute. Too cute. Then he decides to play a mean prank on her, making the Divine Lady jump in fright. A little later, she ended up locking herself in her office and calls our protagonist, asking him to pick her up from her workplace. However, Lin ended up rejecting her request, saying that he was now working out of town. Still, the beautiful lady ended up saying she was very scared that there was something there in the company, and he finally tells her to wait there. A few seconds later, she hears a knock on the door and runs to say that her boyfriend would be there soon, so that person should leave immediately. As soon as she realizes that the previous voice was precisely her boyfriend's, she runs into the protagonist's arms, telling him what just happened. When she finally realized how quickly he got there, he decided to tell her that he was outside the whole time. With that, she ended up arguing with him for playing such a mean prank on her. To calm the Divine Lady's heart, he says he did it just to show her how dangerous it was for her to work so late at night, alone. After that, he takes out a container of fried rice that he had gotten from his aunt earlier. It doesn't take long for her to recognize whose rice that was, since, even though she was a multi-millionaire, she also liked to eat at street food stalls. Since he had scared her, the beautiful lady decided to give him a punishment, where he would basically have to feed her, and let's just say this ended up being more of a reward than a real punishment. It was already late at night, so as soon as she finished eating, he would take her home. This only made the Divine Lady's admiration for him grow even more, since other guys, at this hour, would be getting ready to party, and he was the only one who actually thought about taking her home from work. Lin received a call from Kim, who said he had set him up with some girls who would probably be the protagonist's type, but with a beautiful, angelic vision by his side. Lin replied that there wasn't any girl he could be set up with who was better than Miss G. Doubting the protagonist, Kim asked him to send a picture of her, and he got the idea to take a selfie. Since the Divine Lady had never taken a selfie before, she didn't really know what to do, and also thought she needed makeup, but with beauty like that, who needs makeup? Anyway, the Divine Lady ended up being a little too far away, and he asked her to come closer. After that, he shows her what the perfect angle for the selfie to send to Kim would be, and they finally take the picture his friend had asked for, making Kim extremely envious of the protagonist for the beautiful lady who was next to him. Upon leaving the company, he asked her not to place an order, since he would just take her home normally, but since she wanted to support him in his work, she insisted on requesting a ride. Let's just say that here, he dropped one of those witty lines, saying that a rich woman had come to him, so he would have to make the most of it, in any case. But, clearly, the rich one here is actually him. Inside the car, she asks what he should do to be able to create a charitable foundation. After that, she gives him some instructions he should follow, and, of course, the risks he might also face. But he didn't care much about that and would still do his best. A short time later, they finally finished the ride to the Divine Lady's house, but he still extended an invitation, asking her to accompany him to Yangshen in the next day, and she replies that if she had some free time, it would be an honor to accompany him. When she finally gave the last 5-star review that our protagonist needed, the girl from before appears again, rewarding him for having reached 100% in his current career. After this, she asks if he would like to start a new career, and upon clicking yes, she welcomes him. Basically, his new work experience would be as a physical education teacher. Additionally, he won another 500 million, and also a full attribute enhancement potion and the knowledge of the sages. Lin ended up thinking it would be too easy to be a PE teacher, and she replies that if he drank that potion, he wouldn't have a problem with any subject required of him or anything like that. The potion was called the knowledge of the sages, and the young maiden replies that, basically, it was the wisdom of all the top scholars in the world, all compiled into a single vial of knowledge, which scared him to think of all the things he would need to know to be able to teach. In physical education at that university, he decided to take the potion given to him by the maid, the beautiful system girl. The protagonist's new career began, and he started receiving knowledge from all subjects, just as she had said before. Furthermore, she says that the potion literally increased all of the protagonist's attributes, so now the guy was in perfect shape. Then, giving the beautiful system lady a big hug as thanks, he receives a call during the night, saying that his Pagani was ready, and that they would send someone to pick it up. After that, he also receives a message from the divine lady saying she couldn't join him the next day, but that she had still booked his flight for the morning. The next day at the airport, he discovered he would be flying first class. While he was relaxing and looking at his cell phone, a guy with 2 companions also showed up in first class. The girls, as soon as they noticed the protagonist, immediately started admiring him. The spoiled kid, out of envy or jealousy, ends up saying that it was more important to be a rich young man with money than just a handsome guy. Lin, hearing what he said, told him to mind his own business if he just wanted to show off in front of them. When the young man sits down, he decides to make a bet with Lin, where basically whoever got the flight attendant's number first would win the bet. Speaking of her, she soon enters to attend to the passengers, and the spoiled kid calls her over, saying that he and his colleague would like to get her number. However, she can only choose one of them. Soon, she remembers a warning she had received earlier, where basically some rich young men might try to flirt with her, but she responds, politely, saying that it was against company rules to take passengers' numbers. But apparently, he didn't really accept that answer, and says that a passenger's wish couldn't be rejected so easily. When the flight attendant notices that Lin was wearing a limited edition watch worth over 10 million, she quickly decided to take his number, leaving the spoiled kid utterly humiliated. And to make matters worse, his companions also ended up mocking him. Then, the young man with him notices the presence of a beautiful lady who had just arrived. Then we see that the beautiful lady was actually, precisely, the divine lady, and the protagonist decides to make another bet with the kid to see who could get the beautiful lady's contact information first. After that, Miss G politely apologizes to Lin, and the kid from before starts to try to strike up a conversation to get her number. However, Lin took an unexpected action, saying that the young man there didn't even stand a chance with her. Without reacting, the kid simply didn't know how to act at that moment, and the protagonist says he has a superpower, where he could basically make her fall in love with him in just 1 second. But from her blushing face, that already happened a long time ago. Since the young man didn't know about their relationship, he said she could go to the police if she wanted, since they had 2 witnesses there, which ended up making her feel even more embarrassed by Lin's attitude. But since the plane was too crowded, he just wanted to get some fresh air. Besides, she was clearly feeling more and more embarrassed with the whole situation. With that, he finally made the young man admit defeat and acknowledge that Lin was truly incredible. Then, Lin asks why she was there, since she had said she would be busy. And clearly, she had only told a little white lie to accompany him on his visit to the orphanage that day. Meanwhile, the guy from before was full of envy for our protagonist. Since Lin didn't like what the spoiled brat had just called him, he decided to confront him. The young man then responds by saying he didn't even know her, yet he still put his arms around her waist, reaffirming that he was indeed what he had just been called. With that, Lin says that this was actually love at first sight that would lead to marriage, and that he could never understand something like that. After that, she ends up scolding him a bit, saying that he had been taking advantage of her ever since they got on the plane, thus receiving a light pinch from the beautiful lady, who no longer knew how to respond to his provocations. A few hours later, they finally arrive at the orphanage where Lin grew up, and although the properties there were even cheaper, that building was certainly worth tens of millions. This made Lin's admiration for Wang Ma grow even more, since soon, some children noticed the presence of our protagonist with his girlfriend, and she hands them some gifts she had brought, especially for the little ones, with a smile so sweet like that. It's a bit hard to resist. When Wang Ma says he could have let her know he was visiting so she could have prepared his favorite dishes, he replies that he wanted to surprise them. What a surprise, since she had been rushing him to find a girlfriend soon, and he ended up taking a plane. The divine lady introduces herself, and her full name is Yi Qing Yang, but I prefer to keep calling her the divine lady, beautiful maiden, and the original Miss G, since from now on they would be family. Mrs. Ma told her she didn't need to bring anything next time. When the old woman goes out to divide the items for the children to eat, she realizes that the young Lin Yi had also come to visit them with her boyfriend, on the exact same day as our protagonist. When Miss G asks who she was, he replies that that girl also lived in the same orphanage as him, but she managed to go to college while he had gone to Shanghai. It doesn't take us long to see Yu with her boyfriend, who, honestly, already looked spoiled and had also brought some gifts for the orphans. And when the young man sees the kids admiring his car, he showed the typical behavior of selfish people, who think that people with less money than them are nothing more than insects. As soon as Yu notices Lin's presence, she asks him to introduce his girlfriend. Politely, the divine lady introduces herself, showing that she was happy to meet the girl. Apparently, Yu ended up finding the divine lady very beautiful and pleasant enough to be her sister-in-law. The admirer here ended up being way too charmed by Miss G and went to greet her, apparently needing a bib. However, Lin quickly interrupts him, saying they didn't need to be so formal at that moment, thus leaving the admirer completely outraged about how he had managed to get a girl as beautiful as her. The young man says he will donate 100,000 to the orphanage, and when Mrs. Ma hesitated to accept the donation, Lin told her to take it. After all, no matter how small a fly's leg is, it's still meat. Upon hearing this, the young man challenges Lin to make a donation as well, and he quickly agrees, saying he would make a donation of 100 million, thinking the protagonist was joking. With that, he asked him to stop telling such jokes so early. The madam then asks them not to talk about it now since they just arrived, but the young man continues the topic, saying that if he donated 100 million, he would donate 10 times more than him. Lin, hearing this, decides to make a call, giving the account number to have 100 million sent to the madam. As soon as it's sent, she receives the money, and she almost has a heart attack seeing so many zeros in her account. The guy from before didn't believe it, and decided to personally check Lin's phone. Seeing that it was really true, Lin asks when he would make his $1 billion donation to the madam, as that's what he said he would do. Even the divine lady realized that her boyfriend was a lost cause and really liked to provoke people. After that, the guy didn't even know where to hide his face and soon leaves, saying he had things to do, therefore, he was going to leave. When Miss Yu tries to go after him, the protagonist says she wouldn't be happy with him, so it was better to let him go. Then the madam asks where he had gotten so much money, and the divine lady answers that he had major projects worth hundreds of millions of US dollars. With that, she asked for his account number so she could return the money she had just received. However, Lin replies that she should keep the money, as he was now able to get even more than that and asks them to go eat. At lunch, the divine lady asks if he would like to accompany her to a branch of her company, as there were some problems happening and she needed to solve them. Just a heads up, I found out that she was actually the president of the company that Lin used to work for, from which he was fired on his first day, meaning she was the one with more authority than anyone there. Therefore, she was possibly the founder of the company. Lin replies that the chances of finding anything there are low, but since she was too naive, she ended up thinking that not telling them she was going to pay a visit would do some good in the end. He ended up agreeing to go and says goodbye to his adoptive mother, only for the divine lady to realize the clothes he was wearing. She decided to change before they went to the branch. While he waited patiently outside the door, the beautiful maiden appeared, asking for his help to zip up the zipper on the back of her blouse. However, the zipper ended up getting stuck on some kind of fabric or something, and he asked her to wait until he could get some scissors to cut it. Let's just say one of her garments ended up frayed in one spot, so he needed to cut it or the zipper wouldn't close. After finally managing to cut the thread, they managed to get to the divine lady's branch. At the reception, it was clear the employees weren't expecting her there, and she soon orders that the vice president bring that year's accounts to the meeting room while she reviewed the books. We can get a slight glimpse of the great beauty the character possessed, and now that you've stared long enough, we can continue with the recap. She then asks what happened to Wang Cheng, who was someone with power in that branch. Furthermore, the company's accounts were in the red by more than 30 million, and she decided to call the police. Shortly after, some thugs showed up at her office, saying they were there to collect a 1 million debt that Wang Chenghui owed them. Noticing that the divine lady was very beautiful, the shady guy says that if she spent some time with him, he would forgive this debt, leaving the divine lady completely speechless after this comment. But like any self-respecting Sigma, our protagonist realizes that this was all actually a setup by Chengyi himself. When their leader shows irritation upon hearing what Lin just said, Lin asks if 2 million would be enough to take Chengyi to the police. They quickly decide to switch sides, saying they can do that and some extras too, but the only thing Lin wanted was for them to go after the traitor who was embezzling money from the beautiful damsel's company. She, not knowing what to do now, asks for his help, and he tells her to sort out the financial information and he would take it to the police. At the police station's entrance, he says that this matter couldn't be made public because if it were published in the financial newspaper, her company's market value would drop rapidly. And she, after hearing what she had to do, thanks him, saying she wouldn't know what to do if it weren't for him. Soon, Lin replies that she should go alone, as he was going after the guy who was embezzling money. But since this was dangerous, she insisted, saying she couldn't let him go alone. However, the protagonist hands her the documents, asking her not to worry about him, and finally sets off to find the guy, while the divine lady asks him, in her thoughts, to be careful. 3 hours later, Lin shows up with Cheng, and we see the divine lady all dejected about the whole situation. But as soon as she sees our protagonist, it seems her world was filled with color again, and she runs out, asking if he was hurt, but he replies that he was fine and that the rest was now up to the police and the judge. The thug then apologizes to Miss G, saying he would even return the money, the house, the car, and everything he managed to buy with it. However, it was already too late for him, so he would have to pay for his crimes. Since they had nothing else to do there after solving this problem, she tells them to go, say goodbye to her mother, and return to Yunga. And soon, at the place where they would be staying, she says that thanks to him, everything worked out. Therefore, as a reward for his recent actions, she would cook especially for him, leaving Lin relatively surprised to find out she knew how to cook, and she reveals that, in fact, she had great culinary skills. After that, she decided to show off her skills in the kitchen, and let's just say it seems she must have other kinds of skills as well, if you know what I mean. While he was tasting the delicious food that the divine lady had prepared, especially for him, she asked him to try even more. Then, he mentions that he had seen her talking on the phone recently, and asks if she was resolving matters related to the previous case, but she, in fact, was already preparing the evidence so she could hire a new person the next day, and since she was the president of the company, she had to be able to handle these things quickly. After Lin finished eating, he comments that he didn't expect her to be so good at this, therefore, he decided to give her a reward as well. She even tries to say that he didn't have to do anything, since he was the one who had helped her company so much recently. However, Lin quickly approaches her to reward her, asking her to close her eyes, and she soon ends up receiving a great reward from our protagonist, who, obviously, doesn't beat around the bush and takes life very seriously. He notices that she had gone to the company early and suddenly receives a mysterious call. Upon answering, it was the human resources manager from the university where he would be teaching, saying that he could officially start the next day, and he replies that he would be there on time. Early the next morning, we get a beautiful view of this university, where you could basically see that the place was mostly filled with beautiful, healthy young people. Then, he gets a call from his girlfriend, who was a gorgeous woman, asking him to give her a ride. But he says he couldn't anymore, since he had stopped being a driver to become a university professor, and as it was his first day on the job, he couldn't leave early. Initially, she didn't quite believe him, but clearly with the physique he had, and the instructions he also received when he drank that potion before, he was more than qualified to work there. It doesn't take long before the university students start admiring our protagonist, saying that if they had such a handsome professor, they would never skip class. In the office, Lin introduced himself as the new professor, and here we meet the university's director named Sui. Clearly, she wasn't there to waste time, so she quickly told him that he would have to work hard there. She had a task for him to complete, and only then would he receive a class to teach. In this part, I'll try to summarize it well for you. From what I understood, Lin's task here was precisely to contract some hotels to secure an internship worth 3,000, with accommodation included for the intern, but even upon realizing the director's true intentions, he politely replies that he would try, even though it was a very difficult task. Shortly after, one of the professors showed Lin where he would be working and gave him some advice, so he could complete that task a bit faster. With that, Lin decided to immediately contact the hotels that the professor had given him, but it seemed he had another plan up his sleeve and, as he was the owner of the Peninsula Hotel, he decided to call his general manager, asking her to quickly come to where he was. A short time later, the protagonist explains to the manager the plan he had in mind, and after that, he decided to go to where the director was. She, thinking he was breaking the rules by bringing a stranger there, was about to start scolding Lin. However, he said that since she had asked him to contact a place for an internship, he had done so, and there was the person responsible for the hotel he had contacted, its manager. Not knowing the situation well, she thought that girl was actually his new girl, but she ended up misunderstanding. Impressed with Lin's efficiency, she couldn't believe he had found a place so quickly. With that, Lin introduces the general manager of the Peninsula Hotel, asking her to discuss the details with the director. Then, the manager introduces herself and says that she had accepted their offer to pay a salary of 3,500, in addition to the accommodation cost for the new intern, and that if she had any complaints regarding the salary, they could discuss it further. However, the director had no complaints at all, so her colleagues would soon be in contact with her again. Then, Lin received some skill points as a reward, thus completing 20% of his career, and, as a reward for that, he obtained the Shanghai Longshin Institute, which was a highly renowned research institute. Lin was unconsciously staring into space, and the professor asks if he was okay, but he replies that he was just lost in thought. Furthermore, the professor mentions that it was truly amazing how he managed to solve such a difficult problem in such a short time. A short time later, Lin's general manager says goodbye, and soon asks if he could now schedule his class for the next day. The principal then, having no more excuses this time, said he could, and finally our protagonist says goodbye to her. As Lin left the principal's office, he asked the secretary or teacher, "I also didn't quite understand what this person's role really is," to prepare only the physical education class for Lin. We then find out that the attendance rate in the physical education classes was less than 30%. Therefore, if the attendance rate was below 95%, the teacher's salary would be immediately cut in half. But apparently, that was precisely what she wanted, as it made perfect sense for Lin to receive this responsibility. We continue with Lin going to visit the cruise port he had won, until a car suddenly almost runs him over. On top of that, the driver said that he was basically the one in the wrong, and that he shouldn't touch the car. As soon as the woman gets out of the car, she starts bragging that her car is worth 1 million. Therefore, he wouldn't be able to pay if the car got scratched. But the protagonist replies that it was just an A8, and besides, not even when he drove a Pagani did he act like her. But, apparently, the woman didn't even believe a word of what he had just said, showing herself to be a completely arrogant person. In the meeting room, she eventually gets called out for being late and says she ran into someone in the parking lot who made her run late. Initially, we notice a rivalry between this woman and another female employee of the company, and that has been going on for some time, and soon our protagonist appears, leaving the harpy from before, shocked to see that the owner of the place was precisely the guy she had just called a bastard. When Lin asks if she was an employee of that company, an employee tells him her position and that she was also famous. But since she was so famous, both of them should leave, as they didn't need people like her there. The young woman from before starts apologizing for acting that way earlier, asking for another chance. But since people with her attitude weren't worth his time, they ended up being excluded from this operation and losing a huge opportunity. After that, the other girl from before begins to explain her plan to make it the largest cruise terminal in the world. Lin actually liked her idea and asks what she could do if she received 200 million for the renovation. She quickly replies that she would turn that port into one of the top 5 in the world. When he asks if she could keep the port as a leader in the sector for more than 10 years, if he invested 800 million, she and the other employees were left speechless upon hearing such an exorbitant sum of money mentioned. But, even so, the young woman replies that she was sure she could meet his expectations, and with that, he finally decides to leave, saying he would pay 200 million up front for the project. Then, our protagonist received a call from the director of the Longshin Research Institute, who wanted to talk to him about the acquisition of the institute by Lin. The next morning, he arrived relatively happy for the new workday, but the principal soon asks him to prepare for the class. Then, she explains about the attendance rate, saying that if it were less than 95%, the total bonus for the class would be reduced. But he was still happy, especially since he wasn't there just for the money. He just wanted to be able to teach his class. However, since she had already arranged everything, he was practically forced to teach the class. Now, on his way to the classroom, he runs into 2 students who stop him, asking him if he was going to teach the class, since he had a textbook in his hand. Lin replies that his next class would be precisely physical education and that he was heading to the classroom. At that moment, the girls then ask him where his classroom was so they could support him, and, right after telling them the classroom's location, he decided to leave. The girls then sent a message to their friends, saying that the new teacher would be teaching shortly, thus alerting everyone who could attend his class. For now, in the classroom where Lin was going to teach, there were few people present, and the principal arrives shortly after, thinking that he wouldn't be able to break the 50-person mark in his classroom. However, suddenly, they notice a suspicious movement around and discover that many of the students had come to watch our protagonist's class. She, not knowing what to do or what was happening, began to wonder what that was, and, apparently, Lin's good looks were attracting all the girls to his class, or at least a small portion of them. But it seems it wasn't just the girls who had come to watch his class, as there were even male students there too, and, in a short time, The classroom was completely full. The teacher then asks them to leave, since it was no longer necessary to count how many students were in the classroom, but she insisted on staying and said she would like to see how he would teach this class. As in a normal class, he decided to start by taking attendance so that anyone who wasn't called could approach him to sign up for his class. Half an hour later, they had already passed the 120 mark and they still hadn't put all the names on the attendance list. The principal then mentions that the registration could be set aside, so they could start the class immediately, but apparently, the girls didn't like that very much, especially since he might end up forgetting them. Besides, he had his own teaching method, so she shouldn't interfere with the rhythm of Lin's class, so she received some looks with completely menacing intentions directed at her, and eventually, the principal ended up giving in and letting Lin teach the class his own way. When the registration was finished, he was ready to start the class, but a girl mentions that he hadn't called her name, so he decided to take the role again. But in the end, the bell rang and he says goodbye to his students, saying they would continue in the next class. Even the principal was left speechless, as she had never seen anything like it in her life. Then, she asks her superior if his classes were up to par and, very angrily, she finally gave in and said yes. Lin says goodbye, since he still had many things to do. A short time later, he gets a visit from the system girl from before, the usual one, congratulating him for successfully completing his first class. As a reward, he had earned a master's memory, and he asks what the difference was with the knowledge of the sages that he had recently received. Basically, the knowledge of the sages was very broad, but the master's knowledge would provide specialized experience in a certain field, but he was the one who had to select the knowledge he wanted to use. After that, he asks who the most powerful man in the field of chips was, and when she tells him, he decides to acquire that exact mastery for himself. With that, he was definitely prepared to make a major breakthrough in the chip industry. At the launching research institute that Lin owned, we see two employees, Lu Jin and Li Shu, two important people, at the institute, waiting for our protagonist. The woman then became indignant, thinking their research might end soon, since the institute was acquired by some rich young man. However, the vice president soon tries to calm her down, as she was being too hasty in acting and thinking that way. Another person joins the conversation, and basically, he believed that Lin knew nothing about the research institute, and speaking of the devil, he arrives a little later and the vice president decided to show our protagonist around the place. He then comments that their equipment was too outdated, but the older man replies that they had no way of replacing it at the moment, as they didn't have enough money. The older man then provides information on their current situation, and Lin says he'll take a look and get back to them later. The guy from before then tries to talk to Lin, saying he had a few things he'd like to say as a team member. Basically, he was asking the protagonist not to meddle too much in their work, allowing them to do things their own way. After that, he asked what degree the guy who had just spoken to him had, and he replied that he had a doctorate in information and communication technology. Then, Lin replies that he thought his diploma was from kindergarten, given the way he had just acted. The guy then brags a bit about the university he graduated from, thinking he was a rare talent, therefore asking him not to insult him if possible, but Lin only looked down on ignorant people like him. Besides, he had absolute control over the institute, so if he didn't want to follow his orders, he just had to pack his things and leave. The vice president then tries to defend the guy, and he again replies that if he left now, it would be an incalculable loss for Lin. This was because of the research he was conducting, which could allow them to advance at least 10 years in the national chip industry. Since the guy thought too highly of himself, Lin took the opportunity to teach him a lesson that the world doesn't revolve around him. But the young man still insisted that without him, that project would never be completed. Then, he asks the vice president what this project was, and when the older man finishes explaining exactly what it was, the protagonist asks if it was difficult, and he replies that it was. With that, he decided to do it instead of the previous guy. Then the vice president asks what Lin's degree was in, to which he replies that he had a degree in marketing. The old man was surprised by him, and with Lin's initiative in solving that problem, even the guy from before decided to let him work in peace, and a short time later, he had already found several errors and other bugs as well. After finishing rewriting all the code, they could now continue with the rest of the tests. When the guy asks if he didn't need to check again, Lin replies that it wouldn't be necessary. The deputy director, looking more closely, realizes that it was a perfect structure for them to work with, and since he had solved a problem that the previous young man had taken a long time to fix, he could now leave, as they no longer needed him there. After this, Lin asks the old man to make a list of the obsolete equipment and send it to him, so they could be replaced with more modern ones, adding that he would call him later to send the 50 million so they could buy the new equipment, and he would also add a salary bonus for them. After that, the old man from before had nothing more to say and just thanked him for such generosity. The girl then apologizes for having acted that way before and says she would like to ask him a professional question. However, as he didn't have much time available, he ends up giving her his personal contact information so she can contact him again if she had any questions. As he was leaving, the deputy director decided to accompany him and, suddenly, Lin notices the presence of two people there, one of them being the president of the university where the protagonist taught, who was there possibly to borrow the laboratory. But since the institute had now been purchased, he would have to speak directly with the owner of the place, and the deputy director decides to introduce who the new owner of the lab was. The president, after greeting him, says they would pay for the use of the lab, but the protagonist says that wouldn't be necessary and, furthermore, they would donate the old equipment to the university, since it was no longer useful to them. The president's secretary asks if they knew each other, and Lin replies that they had met in the Human Resources Department a few days ago. Soon, the president asks what he was doing teaching at a university, if he had the purchasing power to buy the research institute and, as always, he simply replies that it was to experience life. Since Lin had made an invaluable donation to the university's research team by donating the equipment, the vice president was going to promote him to vice director. However, our protagonist didn't want to be too important there, so he would be given this position, but it would be kept private and few people would know. The next day, Lin was getting ready for another day of work, until suddenly a boy, a spoiled brat, arrives to disturb his peace. When Lin heard the young man was behind him and asked who he was, we soon discover that this boy was actually some kind of admirer of Director Shu, and was there thinking that Lin was causing trouble for her, but in reality, I think he was just jealous of him, and even Lin must have thought so too. The young man said that he was just a nuisance, so it would be better if he left. However, as Lin wasn't receiving the orders from anyone, he openly decided to go against the young man's will. The professor tries to warn Lin not to say anything, since the spoiled young man was the nephew of the school's vice president. It wasn't long before Mrs. Shu also arrived, asking why this spoiled brat was there, since she had asked him not to visit her office anymore. Furthermore, regarding the professional relationship between her and Lin, the young man had no business interfering, thus leaving the brat from before utterly humiliated. Seeing how close they were, she then explains that she only did it because she didn't want the boy to keep bothering her, but our protagonist didn't mind helping a beautiful woman, and with that comment, he managed to make her see him in a different light. A short time later, after the young man left, she receives a call from the university's vice president, and she says he wanted to speak precisely with Lin. And finally, she asks him to be nice so as not to worsen his situation. In the vice president's office, we see the boy, from before, who was saying that at that very moment, they were firing Lin, but before that, he would like to know the real reason. Lin's qualifications were not enough for him to teach at that university. After that, he decided to reply to a message on his phone where the university president said he had prepared everything for him to become the honorary vice director. However, since he was now being fired, there was nothing more he could do about it. Upon hearing this, the president quickly goes to the room where Lin was to find out what was happening. The vice president even tries to explain that Lin's skills were not suitable for him to work there, but of course, the president didn't believe him, especially since he had gone to great lengths to bring him to the university as a vice president. And yet, the vice president managed to put him in such an embarrassing situation, despite all the trouble he'd taken to bring Lin there. The president then says that Lin was the director of the Longshin Research Institute, and the only ones unworthy of a position there were precisely him and his nephew. Therefore, they should resign, voluntarily. The former vice president even begs for a second chance. But the president replies that he had already given him too many opportunities, and that his nephew was always getting him into trouble. With that, the young man ended up getting a good slap across the face for his selfish attitude. After all this embarrassment, the president apologizes to our protagonist. Furthermore, he was promoting Lin to be the new vice president of the university, but he ended up politely declining, as he just wanted to be an ordinary professor and be left in peace. Since the president knew he was very low-key, they would say he was just a deputy director, but he would still be the vice president. Therefore, they wouldn't make his position public, and in the end, Lin ended up accepting. In the director's office, the professor from before was upset, thinking that Lin would be fired, but soon the president shows up there with him. He wasn't there just to talk, and he broke the news that the vice president had been fired along with his nephew, and finally introduces Lin as the new deputy director, and asks if she was okay with them sharing the same office. And finally, the president takes his leave from his employees. The professor then asks what happened, since not only had he not been expelled, but he had also managed to get promoted. And Lin simply replies that the chairman had indeed seen some potential in him. Once again, the girl from before appears, rewarding him for reaching 60% of his career path, and as a reward, he ended up getting the Twin Towers. A short time later, he received a call from the exact location of the towers, thus setting up a meeting so he could check out the property he had just acquired. Since he now owned many properties, he needed to create a company to consolidate them all. The one thing he didn't realize upon entering the room was that the director was getting ready in the office, and soon, an employee pushes our protagonist aside so she could finish. But, completely unabashed, and at a celebratory event of some sort, our protagonist was fully in character, and there he ends up meeting the Divine Lady, who apparently asked for just a minute. Since he wasn't made of steel, he decided to go get something to eat because he was very hungry. Suddenly, a girl comes up wanting to add him on a social media app, but since Lin turned her down, the girl left, completely indignant with him. The protagonist then overhears the Divine Lady talking with some women at the venue, where a design company had won an $800 million contract for a major project that was about to happen, more specifically the renovation of the ship terminal, and he realizes that, in fact, the company the girls were talking about was precisely the one he had hired to do the renovation at the port. A young man then appears, striking up a conversation with the lady. Yes, after all, she was also interested in that major project that was happening soon. The young man offers her a deal, saying that if she wanted to take on that project, he could work something out. And our protagonist just watched the conversation from the sidelines. Since the young man held such an important position, she suggested he come to her company so they could talk, but he ended up saying they could just go to dinner to discuss the matter further. This just made our protagonist finally take the reins of the situation, saying that the Divine Lady didn't have time to meet with someone like him. And then, she finally replies, saying that she had recently scheduled an appointment with Lin. Therefore, she would have to decline his invitation. The young man then said she was being too arrogant, as she was missing out on an opportunity worth hundreds of millions. But since Lin was the one with complete control over the project, he said that the design project would not be given to him, as he knew another company more promising than his. In the end, Lin ended up convincing the young man to call his cousin, who was the head of the design company. Furthermore, he put the cell phone on speaker so that everyone could hear, and when our protagonist introduces himself to speak with the cousin, the guy on the phone finally recognized his voice. The young man from before asks if his cousin knew Lin from somewhere, and he replies that he was actually the owner of the ship terminal, and the project had been given to him precisely by Lin, seeing as it was Lin who was in charge of everything. The young man starts apologizing like everyone else for his rude attitude earlier, and, let's just say that this time, our protagonist ended up accepting it and letting it slide. He then tells the Divine Lady that he would be waiting for her in the lobby, since he was very tired, and as he was going there, we see that the women were completely charmed by him. When Miss G finally arrives at the place he mentioned, he was pretending to sleep on the couch, and soon we see the beautiful damsel approaching him calmly, so as not to wake him up. However, he soon pulls her closer to him, and he was just pretending this whole time. The Divine Lady was surprised by Lin's attitude in buying the Wanyang terminal, especially since, even while doing his usual work, he was always investing in other businesses too. At the end of this conversation, she says she couldn't disagree with him, and would do her best to finish the terminal project with quality and quantity. However, he soon mentions that he never said he would give her the terminal project. Still, if he didn't, he would sleep on the couch and receive a small punishment from the Divine Lady. And in the end, this all turned out in the best way possible, as we are seeing now. The next day, he had gone to visit the Twin Towers, precisely, and suddenly a girl appeared calling out to him. This girl's name was Mochin Wan, a classmate of Lin's in college. As some time had passed, she asks him what he had been doing for a living, and he replies that he was now a university professor. The girl then starts to belittle his job a little, since she earned much more than him, even though he was the nerd of the class in the past. Then, she asks what he was doing there, more specifically, at the Twin Towers, and he replies, asking if she would believe him if he said he was there to get the apartment. At one point, he asks if there was something wrong with her company, since there were so many people at the entrance, and she replies that the mysterious tycoon who bought the Twin Towers will be visiting that day to do the paperwork, so her vice president and the other executives were there to welcome him. Her boyfriend shows up, next, asking her to follow him. Soon, she then introduces her boyfriend to Lin, suggesting they set a day for the three of them to have dinner, and so her boyfriend could try to get him a job. However, the arrogant guy immediately refuses, and as if that wasn't enough, he also says that the person she wanted him to have dinner with was unimportant. Therefore, it would be a complete waste of time to eat with him. And soon, she says goodbye to Lin with her arrogant boyfriend, who didn't even know who he was really talking to. Even our protagonist was surprised by the young man's lack of consideration earlier, while the people from that company were waiting precisely for our protagonist. Lin mentions that he had only bought 2 of their buildings, but the reception was still too grand. When the guy from before realizes that Lin was the one being received, the couple was shocked by his presence and also outraged, since they didn't know who Lin really was. The girl then tries to talk to Lin to get him to leave, saying that place was not for him. The president then asks what she was doing, and she replies that he was her former classmate, and therefore, he wasn't quite right in the head. In addition, her boyfriend arrives calling for security to get rid of our protagonist, but he ends up getting a good slap in the face, since our protagonist was actually the one who bought the Twin Towers. Therefore, the 2 of them had to pack their things and leave that company immediately. The girl, not believing any of it, asks Lin if he had really bought the Twin Towers, and he replies that he had tried to tell her before, but she hadn't believed him. After that, her boyfriend now wanted to have a dinner date with Lin. However, it was already too late. After all, a few minutes earlier he had said that Lin wasn't qualified to have dinner with him, and let's just say the tables have now turned. The president then asks him to ignore those people and tells them to go to the meeting room. Once inside, he had to sign a pile of papers that made him tired just looking at how much he had to sign. A half hour later, our protagonist had finally finished signing, and with that, the president congratulates him on his acquisition. He also asks if Lin had a suitable candidate to manage the property, since the Twin Towers were now his responsibility. The protagonist asks if the manager had anyone in mind. After suggesting a potential candidate for Lin to hire, Lin asks him to contact the person to finalize the formalities. Just then, as they are leaving the company, we see the loser couple who had just been fired after doing an excellent job of annoying the owner of the building. The girl from before takes the opportunity to break up with the guy, whom she had so proudly called her boyfriend just a little while ago, even saying she wanted to marry him. He didn't expect this, and she replies that Lin had written her a love letter in the past, and now she was going to get with him. Only then did he realize the kind of person she truly was. In the end, it seems everything is just about money here, except for the heavenly lady who acts differently from this rattlesnake. A short time later, our protagonist finally appears, and the anaconda shows up, throwing herself at him, saying she had just broken up with her boyfriend. He asks what that has to do with him. The girl replies that since he had written her a love letter in the past, she was now giving him a chance. Therefore, he'd better take it. But apparently, the girl must have hit her head, since the person who actually wrote that letter was someone else entirely and not him. With that, the anaconda ended up facing huge embarrassment, as several people there began to badmouth her because of her despicable attitude. Since our protagonist had nothing more to do there, he quickly says goodbye to the girl, as he still had a lot to do. The rattlesnake ended up getting into his car without permission, asking him to take her home, since she had just been fired. However, this made him absolutely furious, since he hadn't even given her permission to get into his car. The girl from before continued to insist on staying in our protagonist's car, solely because they had been classmates in the past. Since she refused to get out of his car, he decided to call the police, and only then did she agree to leave the vehicle. After that, we see a scene of what looks like a fight, where, basically a suspicious-looking man was demanding that Miss Jean give him compensation. Since there was no need for him to make such a big scene, just over what happened, she said she would pay for the repairs. Since the old man, suspicious, he thought she wouldn't have enough money to pay for his car's repair, and he came up with a second option, so that this debt could be paid. Basically, she would need to be his secretary, and with that he could deduct from her salary little by little to pay for his car's repair. However, upon hearing this, the young woman's tone of voice changed, saying the old bastard was dreaming way too big. The scoundrel from before takes a handkerchief from his pocket with some kind of substance on it, placing it directly over Miss Jin's nostrils. After inhaling what was on the cloth, she started to feel dizzy, but to his dismay and her delight, our protagonist suddenly arrives. When the beautiful young woman realizes he has appeared, she decides to run into his arms. He asked what had happened to her wrist, since it was red, and she replies that it was precisely the bastard, trying to knock her out. When Lin asks for more details about what really happened, she mentions what the perverted guy from before had said. According to him, the wind knocked his motorcycle onto his car, and he started demanding that she pay for the repairs. Since Lin also had some detective skills, He started to think that it wasn't that windy that day, so there was no way his motorcycle could have been knocked over so easily, especially since there was a security camera filming everything that happened. Lin said they would check the footage in detail to see if everything the suspect said was really true. This made the perverted scoundrel quickly change his mind, saying that he would find a place to repair his car himself. Noticing the man was in a big hurry, our protagonist says that if anything suspicious was going on, he would call the police. The guy quickly knelt down when he heard what Lin said, claiming he had a family and young children, and begged him not to call the police. However, when it was time to try and kidnap the beautiful young woman to take her somewhere, he apparently didn't think much about his family. Since Lin was feeling generous that day, he ended up letting the incident slide, saying that next time he would definitely send him to jail. With all this commotion, Miss Jin ended up mentioning that she felt dizzy, and he said he would take her home right away. Inside the car, he asked her why she didn't buy a car for herself, since she was now a sales manager. She replies that it wasn't a good idea for now, since she had just been promoted. He then tells her not to worry about what people might say and that one of these days he would take her to a dealership to pick one out for herself. At this point, Miss Jin started having some hallucinations, probably due to the substance she had inhaled from the cloth earlier, but it wasn't long before she offered herself as payment to our protagonist for helping her. Although the offer wasn't half bad, Lin simply asked her not to be impulsive, since they would be at her place soon. Upon arriving at the beautiful young woman's house, it was already clear that she either hadn't had much time to tidy up, or was just plain lazy. Despite all the mess, she quickly starts to tidy up, apologizing for him having to see that. Lin ends up mentioning that he's feeling very hot, so while she takes a shower, he could just sit and wait, and as soon as she finished, they could grab a bite to eat, and that's what he did, deciding to wait by playing a famous game that many know, if not almost everyone. However, it wasn't long before she showed up, asking him to see what was wrong with her, as her body was hot and she was still feeling dizzy. Normally, where I live, we call this a fever, but apparently, her problem was completely different. While resting a bit in bed, he asked if she lived alone now, and she revealed that she had recently divorced, so yes, she lived alone. As the beautiful damsel had become too needy, she asked Lin to keep her company for a moment, and after a while, he ended up giving in and decided to keep her company. Even having a deity supporting him, he still got carried away by the moment. I think that after being betrayed, her trust in people was completely destroyed. After all this, he wanted to know the reason why she got divorced, and she said that from the moment her husband cheated on her, their relationship was already over. Lin ends up mentioning that he couldn't imagine a man having the guts to betray such a beautiful woman. I just think he forgot what he had just done with the divine lady. As he was no longer useful there, he decided to leave, but she asked him to stay that night, as it was very late and it could be exhausting to drive, and he would leave in the morning. However, since he had to teach the next day, and his house, it was very far from the university, it was better for him to go. Speaking of the next day, early in the morning, he noticed something had happened to his desk. The principal's secretary then mentioned that since he was now the deputy director, he would need to stay in the same office as Director Su. However, according to him, he didn't want to share a room with a tigress and asked the secretary for help to move the desk back. Speaking of the tigress, it didn't take long for her to appear next, not knowing where to hide her face. Lin even tried to cover it up, saying she had misheard. Later that same day, she ended up receiving a call, saying that one of her students was going to jump off the building, which made her start to panic quickly as she prepared to leave. She tells Lin and the secretary what they had just said, and apparently, the student wanted to jump because of something that happened at work. Since she didn't think it was a good idea to go to the place alone, she decided to call our protagonist as well, while in the car. Lin asks who the girl was that wanted to jump, and she mentions that the girl's name was Sun Xiaoyu, an exceptional student who would graduate that year. After her internship, she had rented an apartment, so the principal didn't know much about what had happened. The secretary asked where she worked, as that was what the principal had said before. She said the girl worked in the capital, Jeonhan, and since that name sounded familiar to Lin, she remembered that it was actually Kim Han's company. It didn't take them long to arrive at the place where everything was happening, and they quickly realized that there was indeed someone on top of the building who intended to jump, and soon we see a beautiful girl with pink hair about to jump at any moment. The principal, seeing that, decided to go in, and although the police officer said they couldn't, she said they were the girl's teachers, therefore, they could help by trying to talk to her, and the police officer ended up letting them into the place. As soon as they arrived, a woman who looked like a teacher asked them to speak with the young lady. The director ends up asking the girl why she wanted to end her life, since she had recently said that she had found a good job. He then asks her to calm down and tell them what had really happened, since they were there to help her. With that, the young woman ends up saying that she had been harassed and her boyfriend didn't believe her, which is why she no longer wanted to live. This news left all the teachers there completely speechless, but Lin soon asks her to calm down and tell them who had done this to her. With tears in her eyes and her heart full of pain, the girl replies that it was the vice president of the company where she worked, and she never would have thought he would be capable of doing something like that. The director even tries to calm her down, but she didn't realize she had gotten too close. Realizing that the director had moved closer, the girl tells her to keep in her distance, because if they got any closer, she would definitely jump. Since Lin was already tired of this drama, he told her to go ahead and jump, especially since she shouldn't be wasting everyone's time, as they all had things to do. Besides, if she died, it would be for nothing anyway, since the problem wouldn't be solved and the guy who put her through this would still be free without any punishment. The director even tries to say they would certainly help her, but the beautiful young woman didn't believe that would happen, especially since he was the vice president of a massive company and they couldn't fight against them. Lin promised he would send the guy to jail. However, if she still wanted to die, he could never stop her. Therefore, it was better for her to decide quickly, since he didn't want to waste his precious time. When Xiaoyu was about to respond to what he said, she accidentally lost her balance and was about to really fall, and if it hadn't been for our protagonist who caught her in his arms, pulling her back to safety, the girl would have probably been turned into pulp. The local police officer ended up praising Lin for what he did, but he just says it was nothing. Besides, they still needed to take a statement from her about what happened so justice could be served. Meanwhile, the girl from before was wondering if they could really get justice, since Jonhan Capital was very powerful. However, she didn't even have time to react when she realized Lin was heading straight for Jonhan Capital. Miss Su ends up asking what he thought he could accomplish there and if he believed he would be more effective than the police. His response was that Xiaoyu was a student at their university, therefore, he had to help get her justice, and decided to go find evidence. Determined to stop Lin, she asked her secretary to look after the girls and soon appeared in the car he was in, telling him to calm down. She also wanted to help the girl get justice, but according to her, they didn't truly know who they were dealing with, asking him not to be so impulsive. He rudely replies that it was none of her business and that she should get out of the car, but being the beautiful and stubborn woman that she is, she said she wouldn't leave and would go wherever he went, and so they finally head off to get justice, arriving at the company. He says he's looking for Quiven Long. The receptionist, realizing he didn't have an appointment, didn't give him the location of the person he was looking for. After that, Lin decided to call Kim, asking which office the person he was looking for was in. After giving the person's location information, Kim says that if there was any problem, he just had to say the word and he would solve it. But according to the protagonist, it was no big deal. He was just going to give the perverted guy a pair of silver handcuffs. While the scum of society was talking to another person in his office, our protagonist arrives, barging into his room in the best way possible, asking the scum if he hadn't had enough fun. When a being who doesn't even deserve to be called an animal mentions that he could put them in jail, the protagonist replies, saying that the one who should be arrested was him, precisely for the recent incident where he had harassed a student from Lin's university. At that moment, the scum realized they were actually Xiaoyu's teachers. According to the imbecile, he was just about to look for them. This guy's version is that the one who took the initiative was precisely Xiaoyu, and since he wanted nothing to do with her, she decided to frame him. But of course, that's a complete lie, and the teacher went after him without a second thought. However, she was roughly pushed away by the waste of society, who said he had forwarded the incident to his legal department. When our protagonist saw that scene, he got ready to give the insect a good beating, who even threatened Lin by telling him that if he did anything to him, the protagonist would be arrested. But he completely ignored the insolent man's warning and gave a good kick to his opponent, sending him flying. As usual, the insect from before ordered an employee to call the security guards to arrest our protagonist, and while the insect's helper followed the order he received, he swore he would erase our protagonist from history, or at least that's what he thought he could do, especially since he started being humiliated again in front of everyone there. Even the director started to be impressed by his strength, even though his appearance was that of just a malnourished chicken. Then the security guards arrive, along with the head of the legal department, saying they were going to sue him for intentional injury. However, Lin replies that he was nothing but a coward, and, if he didn't shut up, he would go over and make him shut up himself. The guy mentions that this industry belonged to young Kim, and not even the protagonist could imagine how he would end up 6 feet under. However, Since Lin knew that Kim would be on his side after finding out the whole truth, he continued to teach the scum of society a lesson. The scum, who had already lost a few teeth to our protagonist, said that he was finished because Kim was coming towards them right at that moment. Since Kim's father was this insect's cousin's uncle, he thought he would never be on our protagonist's side. However, Lin replies that even if it were Kim's own father there, he would still give that scoundrel a beating for what he did to his student. Speaking of young Kim, Chow then appears to find out what was happening in his company. The crybaby then tells the young man that the protagonist had gone there just to cause trouble, on top of having hit him. Therefore, they couldn't just let him get away with it. But it was already clear that Kim would never be on their side, especially since because of this despicable person, he ended up being embarrassed. After this, he asks Lin what had happened and that he would definitely help him solve that problem. Then the protagonist explains what that scumbag had done to one of his students and the fact that she was now trying to jump from the building to end her life. Kim was outraged upon realizing what he had done and, on top of that, he still had the nerve to say that it was Lin's student who had seduced him, as if a young businessman could do such a thing. He decided to help our protagonist teach that scum of society a good lesson. The insect even tries to defend himself by saying he was his cousin, therefore he couldn't do this to him. But it was completely the opposite of what Kim really thought. Then he asked Lin to leave him with him, and that he would soon provide a satisfactory solution. The protagonist ended up accepting what the young man said, but still, he would send that scum of society to prison, whether he liked it or not. After this, he also grabs the teacher, telling them to leave, since Kim would take care of the rest. With that, the principal was surprised by the connections he had, and that he had resolved it relatively quickly. Upon leaving the company, she said that he was very powerful, and she wasn't surprised by the way he decided to go there. After seeing the power he possessed, he simply replies that if his students are being harassed, they need to do something. Otherwise, they could never call themselves teachers. This incident exposed a major problem at the school, where the education is very outdated. As a result of all this, the students were unable to adapt to the pace of survival in society when they leave the school's cocoon. Since she agreed with what he said, she mentioned that she would soon speak with the school's president about it, especially since it was really time for some disciplinary education. The cosplay girl from before appears again, congratulating him for having saved a student and for also proposing a reform plan. As he had completed 80% of his career, he ended up winning 1 billion as a reward, and since the task had been completed, he shouldn't forget to go check his prize later. However, Lin ended up not hearing the principal calling him, and soon she asks him what was wrong, as he had been standing there for a while. Since he was apparently very tired, he could go home to rest a bit, and she also asks him if he could accompany her to meet Xiaoyu's boyfriend the next day. As he was also a teacher, he said that she could count on him. After all, he would do what he could to help. At his house, in the Kyushu Pavilion, he received a call from the general manager of the Twin Towers, who wanted to have a meeting with him as soon as possible. As he was very tired at that moment, he asked them to meet the next day at the coffee shop of the Peninsula Hotel. At Kim's house, he ended up being called by his father, and soon we see the big shot, asking if what had recently happened was true, basically that he had sent his cousin to jail. Young Kim replies that since that he had done something wrong and also offended his friend, it was only fair that he learned a lesson. Curious about what kind of person this friend of his was, Kim's father asks if this person really deserved that kind of treatment from him. He replies to his father that Lin was a good friend, and upon hearing his name, the father asks if he was from a well-known and famous family. However, Kim replies that the group he mentioned didn't even come close to his friend, not to mention he was the owner of the Rongai circuit, and was also the owner of the entire Kyushu villa. Hearing that he was really such a rich person, he decided not to talk anymore about the scum of society. However, he still mentioned that Kim should stop playing around and grow up, thinking his father was talking about work. He said that he was doing very well, and that the value of his company's shares had risen to over 10 billion as well. But the old man was actually talking about a girlfriend and had found someone who would be very good for him. Since the young man didn't want to get into a serious relationship at the moment, he even tried to refuse his father's request. But when he saw the photo of the divine lady, he was enchanted by her. However, he ended up realizing that she looked a lot like someone he had seen recently. After that, he shows another picture of the divine lady along with the protagonist to his father, asking if they were the same person, and only then did the old man realize that someone had already gotten there first. Therefore, Kim could go ahead and continue having fun, and finally, he says goodbye to his father, as he still had many things to do. The next day, Lin went to a kind of business office, and you could already tell that the women in the place were charmed by him. At the reception, he was well received by a girl named Feng Shi, and after this, he hands her some documents for his company's registration, and she hands him 2 forms to fill out. When the girl mentions that he could add her on the local social platform so she could contact him later, he says he would just go see her if he needed anything, leaving the girl even more charmed by him. Apparently, a supervisor at the place, seeing how the receptionist was melting over our protagonist, didn't like it very much. Then, Lin shows up saying he would like to register his company along with the form he had recently filled out. However, the envious guy from before quickly starts to find one problem after another, preventing our protagonist from registering the company, as he would like. With that, the receptionist from before became furious with the old bald guy. After a long time, even the beautiful receptionist started to scold the guy from before, and soon Lin hands him the bank receipt with the amount he had indicated on the form for the company's registration, a value of 500 million. At that moment, the girls at the company started to wonder why someone so rich still did things by himself, showing that he apparently didn't have a secretary yet. Since he was handsome and rich, the receptionist from before fell for him completely. Once again, the envious guy from before finds another excuse to return the form, since the address he had put was precisely the Twin Towers. Therefore, the location should indicate the specific floor where his company was. But he soon replies that his company was indeed in the Twin Towers, and he even showed a contract proving that he had paid 18 billion for them the other day. And I have to confess something. I find this protagonist very humble. What he never lacks is humility. Lin then asks if there were more mistakes on the form, completely out of patience to deal with that brat, but this time he finally shut up and just did his job. After that, he felt he was one step closer to his main goal. While he was in his car, he received a call from Director Su, who said she had found Xiaoyu's boyfriend and had arranged a meeting with him at a place near the school. Lin replied that he would be there in exactly 20 minutes. After the 20 minutes passed, he finally arrived at the place where the director was, and it didn't take long to find her on the upper floor. Since the young man had not yet arrived, she tells the protagonist that they would graduate in a month, so it was normal that they no longer took things so seriously. Moreover, the boy's family had a good standing. Speaking of the insect scum, he soon arrives, and you won't take long to understand why I have so much anger towards this brat. The insect's arrogance was such that he asked his teachers to get straight to the point, since he had other more important things to do. Putting his ignorance aside, she says she was only there to talk about the young Xiaoyu, who had recently tried to end her life. However, he didn't even want to or hear about it, as she no longer had anything to do with him. She then says they weren't trying to interfere in his love life, but they would like him to at least comfort Xiaoyu so she wouldn't be so hurt inside. The being who turned out to be worse than the insect scum, but they would like him to at least comfort Xiaoyu so she wouldn't be so hurt inside. The being that turned out to be worse than the scum of insects said he only thought of her as an easy girl and never really intended to be with her. Hearing this, Director Su got upset and was about to give that pest a good slap in the face, which I honestly think would be an excellent idea. But the protagonist stopped her, and the scoundrel from before decided to leave, refusing to comfort the young Xiaoyu. Then she tells Lin that he shouldn't have stopped her, as she would have liked to hit him. But if someone were to do that and record a video, she would never be able to clear her name again. Furthermore, he mentions that she would also need to take the afternoon off, but to do so calmly this time. She wondered how such a person could exist. In the car of the guy from before, his father was scolding him for being late to the meeting with the big shot that afternoon, and he asks if this guy was really that rich. The idiot's father replies that he wouldn't take his son there, if it weren't so important for the family business, and therefore, he should pay attention so he doesn't ruin their business. The scoundrel said he would be careful not to ruin such a big deal and then calls our protagonist, saying that he had arrived. Then, Lin also arrives to welcome his guests. The insect from before couldn't believe it was Lin again, thinking he was only there to insist that he talk to Xiaoyu. His father, noticing the way he was acting, asks him what he was doing, and he replies that the man was a director and a professor at his school, and, after being reprimanded by him that morning, he was there again to torment him. The protagonist then tells the boy's father that he had raised a fine son. After, he started giving him some good slaps, saying he would beat him senseless. Not knowing why he was being hit, the boy said that he was just a simple professor. But the situation changes when his father reveals that he was the one who bought the Twin Towers, and that, since he dared to speak to him that way, the scoundrel's father would continue beating him until he saw the red sun rise. Our protagonist then says that he was a professor just to enjoy life, and, again, the boy's father continues to correct his son, but it's not long before the general manager of the Peninsula Hotel shows up, asking what was happening. Furthermore, He also asked if he would like him to get rid of them, but Lin asked him to leave it to him. Seeing the way the manager of the hotel treated our protagonist, they both started to think that he was also the owner of the hotel. He only confirms their suspicions a little later, saying that he was also the owner of the hotel. Moreover, he asks if for some reason they still had more questions they wanted to ask. The story continues with our protagonist talking to the father of the spoiled kid from before, and he asks Lin not to be too harsh on him, despite the mistakes he had recently made. However, Lin says that the young man didn't do anything serious, but he still did something he shouldn't have. Upon hearing this, the brat's father gives him a look that already makes the young man freeze, and he starts apologizing to our protagonist, saying that he would even get back with the girl he almost ruined and would even marry her if necessary, but he would like another chance. However, the only thing the protagonist asks is for them to forget what happened and to leave the girl alone, without bothering her in the future. Again, the boy's father apologizes, asking for another chance, since in terms of business they could add a lot of value to the protagonist's company. Furthermore, from what I understood, the boy ended up hitting himself, saying that he was really wrong for having acted so rudely before. Then, Lin says that Yang Feng could go outside, while he would like to speak with his father alone. While the young man was waiting outside, the protagonist told his father that he'd better take good care of his son, since if he kept acting like that, his company could run into trouble in the future. At the end of the meeting, they just said their formal goodbyes, and the businessman simply thanked the protagonist for the opportunity. After that, we see a scene where Director Shu's secretary was saying that the matter concerning Yang Feng was hopeless. Clearly, the beautiful director was completely stressed out by the way the young man had acted before, not to mention that he only had a little money, according to her, yet he acted like a rude millionaire. Since not even the protagonist had been able to resolve the situation, he thought it was best to let it go. However, she says that according to Lin's character, he was too calm and not as impulsive as they were. At least, she admits that she almost disfigured the young man's face if the protagonist hadn't stopped her. Her secretary then ends up commenting that he and she made a perfect couple and, from the director's reaction, she didn't seem to think it was a bad idea. However, she then received a call saying that Yang Feng wanted to talk to her, and the director just told her secretary to have him wait in her office, as they would be arriving soon. In her office, she asked what the spoiled young man wanted from her to have gone there. Shortly after, he begins to apologize for before, and asked her not to take what happened personally either. According to the young man, thanks to the lesson that the protagonist gave him, he realized his mistake and would like to see the young Xiao Yu that afternoon, asking if she could take him so he could redeem himself as well, but according to the director, she said it was fine. However, in her thoughts, she told herself that Lin was truly powerful, as he had even taken care of Yang Feng. A while later, more specifically at Miss Yin's house, the protagonist went to visit her and, of course, she allowed him into her residence. He soon tells her that he was there to take her to buy a car, the one he had promised her in the previous episode. If I'm not mistaken, since he hadn't had breakfast yet, she asked him to sit down and at least have the first meal of the day with her, and he ends up accepting the lady's generous offer. As soon as he sits down, he comments that there was no need for such a luxurious meal like that, especially so early in the morning. But she just says that men are different from women and that they needed to eat more. I don't know where she got that from, because I've seen some women eat like 2 construction workers and still not be satisfied. After that, Miss Jean started to pamper our protagonist by feeding him, and he said that married women really knew how to take care of people. She then asked him if he had any requirements when buying a car, but apparently not. She just wanted a pretty white car. He suggested they buy a Maserati, but according to her, that didn't fit the 200,000 budget she had. Besides, she also said she wasn't qualified to drive a car of the same brand as Madame G's, who is our supreme deity, the Divine Lady. I have to comment that I don't like it when our protagonist goes out with other women, even though he had already said she was his girlfriend, but that's just my personal thought. Following this, the protagonist said that she didn't have to pay for it, since he had said he would give her a car and it was time to fulfill his promise. Finally, they went to a dealership to buy her a car. As soon as they walked in, they were quickly attended to and the salesman asks them if they had any preference when buying the vehicle, to which she replies that the car was for her and that the budget she had was only 200,000, but she would still like an attractive car. We see his expression change completely in a flash, so he ordered another saleswoman to attend to the young couple, and she did. However, this ended up enraging the protagonist, since the scoundrel thought their budget was too low and therefore didn't want to show them anything, trying to dodge what the protagonist was saying. The shady guy just said he didn't know anything. so he wasn't even obligated to give him an answer. Then, the manager or owner of the place arrives, asking who owned the Pagani that was outside the dealership. When the guy sees the machine that was outside, he was impressed by its beauty and value. When he asks the manager what was up with the sports car, he replies that he would like to pull in with his car, but the Pagani was blocking the entrance, so he had come to ask if the vehicle's owner could move it so that he could park his car. The protagonist then apologizes and says he will move his car from there shortly. When the salesman saw who the owner of the Pagani was, he couldn't believe what our protagonist had said. The protagonist also says that they weren't welcome in that store anyway, so they were going to check out in the store across the street. The manager then tries to convince him to stay there, saying he was welcome in his store. Even the ignorant guy from before was asking for another chance, saying that he had recognized his mistake. However, it was already too late, as the protagonist did have money to spend, just not in that store. This ended up causing the manager to quickly fire the guy from before, and one more person lost their job, thanks to our protagonist's presence. Upon leaving the dealership, Miss Jing apologized for embarrassing him and admitted it was all her fault. However, he said that when he joined the company at the beginning of the manga, if she hadn't guided him, he wouldn't have even been able to understand the company's workflow, so she didn't need to be as polite as she was being. Putting that conversation aside, he showed her a new car worth almost 1,200,000. Seeing such a beautiful car, she comments that if she were to drive it to work, people would think she had found a rich man to support her. But he says the only thing that matters is whether she likes the vehicle or not. With a beautiful smile on her face, she replies that she does like it. He says that they would take that one then, asking someone to put it on the card. Since she hadn't driven for a long time, he said he would take her to practice when he had time. She thanks him for being so kind and considerate, as well as for giving her a beautiful car. However, according to him, that was just a car, and she didn't have to worry about it. After that, our protagonist decided to go out and meet a young woman who was apparently responsible for the work at the port he owned. It didn't take him long to ask them to come inside so they could talk while they ate something. When he asked how long it would take to complete the first phase of the renovation project, she replied that it would take at least 2 months with the current schedule. However, since that would take too long according to him, he said he would give her another 400 million. Therefore, she should clearly hire more companies. She ended up agreeing, but in her thoughts, she said that she had never seen a client as generous as him. After that, he also mentions that he had created a company called Link Young Group and asked for her help in creating a logo. And in the end, she ends up agreeing, also asking what the company's location was, and he replies by saying it was in the Twin Towers. Then, she says that he was a very promising young man, since the towers had just been completed and that was a milestone important for Yoongi, asking if he had any other design requests for the group's logo. When he mentions that she should change the name to the Link June building in the logo, she says that he even had the right to use the Twin Towers, but it wasn't appropriate for her to change the building's name. Hearing this, he mentions that there was nothing wrong with that, since he had paid for the Twin Towers in full. Surprised by the news, at first, she couldn't believe that he had bought the entire towers. However, since this protagonist is completely humble, he didn't even show any emotion when saying that they were just 2 buildings, and there was no reason for her to be so surprised after hearing what he said. She apologized for acting that way before, and asks if he was busy that day, asking if he wouldn't like to go to her place for some coffee. However, according to him, he was busy and would leave it for next time. After he turned her down, they finally said their goodbyes and she said she would send in the project status to his email. However, as soon as she leaves, we see Director Shu completely out of it, even being carried by an employee from the place. Seeing her, he asks what she was doing there, and she just comments that it was a huge coincidence they ran into each other there. The employee from the place says that she had been cheated on by a man who ran off with his mistress and that she had a few drinks to blow off steam, so he should take her home, since he knew her, leaving the problem solely for the protagonist and getting rid of the complications. Taking her in his arms, he asks where she lived so he could take her to her residence, but she just started to complain, saying that people present themselves as good people, but in the end, it was all just a lie. However, Lin said it wasn't like that, and I think someone needs to warn her before it's too late, because he is even worse. At one point, she ended up mentioning that the protagonist was much better than her ex. Inside the car, he kept asking for her address so he could take her home. However, she didn't want to go home, and, with no other options, he decided to take her to the Peninsula Hotel. Upon arriving there, the hotel manager asks if he has also conquered the director. After all, only a few days had passed since her presence at the school to help the protagonist, but he acts cool, telling him to get the best suite in the place for them and to prepare some drinks as well. Once inside the room, she continued to enjoy the rest of the day to drown her sorrows. Soon, she jokes with him, asking if he was afraid of her or something, then saying she had a surprise for him. However, the only thing I can tell you is that if you want to know what happened, you'll have to read the story. Especially because, unfortunately, I can't say or show what really happened. After that, the system girl appears again, but completely embarrassed for having seen him like that. But, despite all that, she still tells him that his previous job as a teacher was already 70% complete, and if he wanted, he could already start a new job. After accepting what she had said, he would now be an express delivery man. Also, as a reward, he won 10 million won, a limited edition Tamburini T12 motorcycle and motorcycle driving skills. Apparently, he liked this profession as a delivery man more than being a professor at a university. She mentions that the motorcycle was parked in the hotel's parking lot, so he could go check it out. Having completely changed his clothes to ride his new motorcycle, he was thrilled with the beauty of that machine in front of him, not to mention that the motorcycle cost around 6,500,000 in their currency, and was very beautiful as well. After that, he decided to take the motorcycle out for its debut. Then, we see director Sue coming out from somewhere and, when she realized who was on the motorcycle, she was delighted, and soon the heartthrob also appears, completely stealing the show. The beautiful lady then thanks him for what happened the day before, but he just said it would be better if she drank a little less next time. Furthermore, she asks him why he had never gone to the university with that motorcycle, not to mention that all the female students were looking at him a moment ago. However, he replies that that was a place for studying and not for him to be showing off, but if that's the case, she still asked why he had gone with it that day. Then, he replied that he had only gone there to quit, so it didn't matter what he was driving. Worried about the reason, she asked why all this so suddenly and if it wasn't because of what happened the day before, but he says no. When she asked the reason that made him leave that job, he said that he was now going to work as a delivery driver. Since he was very rich and was still going to work in deliveries, she asks if she was allowed to place some orders with him in the future. I think I don't even need to comment on this. After that, she says she would take him to the human resources department so they could take care of the paperwork. It wasn't long before he already received a new order on the app, and even he was impressed, since he had just signed up and had already received orders. As the job couldn't wait, he soon went to deliver the order he had just received, and meets a music teacher from Shanghai. Then, her spoiled son also appears, complaining that the protagonist had delivered the purchase too quickly, since he hadn't even managed to play a little bit. The protagonist mentions that it was good for him to practice the piano, and that it was good for him to understand his mother's good intentions. But if it was so good, the young man then asked why he didn't practice. Realizing the boy's arrogance, he ends up saying that he had indeed practiced, but initially the young man didn't believe him, since the piano was normally a noble instrument. Thus, the protagonist possibly couldn't afford to play it. Then, the brat's mother appears, apologizing for the way her son was acting, as she had spoiled him too much. However, he says it was fine, and that he really could play, so he asked if he could show his skills on the piano. She said that he could, feel free to show them, but that her son was already at a level higher than the 8th grade, far above the level of normal children. The protagonist replies to the lady saying that he was self-taught, but that he could play anything above the level of a small child without a problem. In case you don't know, a self-taught person is someone who instructs themselves through their own effort, without the specific help of a single teacher or tutor or anything similar. The spoiled young man insisted on telling his mother to let him try. However, the protagonist says that if he plays better than him, he should obediently obey his mother and practice the piano properly. Confident that Lin would never surpass him in terms of talent, he ended up accepting his proposal and finally got ready to start playing something. In the protagonist's thoughts, he said that he hadn't played that thing since he received the wisdom of the sages. It didn't take him long to finally start putting on a beautiful show to live for the mother and son. So much so that she was impressed, as that was the 9th most difficult piece in the world, being too complex for even more experienced musicians to finish. She says that he was really hiding his talent, since not even a university professor like her would be able to play something like what he played. Furthermore, she asks if the young man will now listen to his mother and go practice. But the young man started making excuses, thinking that Lin was his mother's student, pretending to be a delivery guy just to trick him. However, he didn't really know the young man's mother, so he asks him if he's being a sore loser. This ended up outraging the young man, and he decided to dedicate himself to his studies this time, unwilling to accept that he had lost to a mere delivery guy. Next, the young man's mother thanks him and comments that she believed that with his skill level, he could easily switch to a better paying job, more specifically one related to the piano. However, he replies, saying that he had no intention of changing jobs for the time being, so he wouldn't bother her any longer and would be leaving. But before that, she asked if she could add him on a social media platform to contact him later when needed, and he ends up agreeing. After that, he received a reward for getting 5 stars on his first delivery, and this reward included Mumbai Beach. This way, he could now connect the Kyushu Pavilion and the Ujjain terminal area. It wasn't long before he received a call, and the person on the line said they were part of the management team for the beach he had just acquired. The person asked when would be a good time for him to come over and handle the formalities, and since he was free at that moment, he decided to head there right away. Upon arriving, he is greeted by a girl named Tina, and it was she who had contacted him earlier. After he properly introduced himself, she handed him some contracts and technical documents for him to check for any errors. The protagonist asks why Mumbai Beach, a public property, was being privatized and auctioned off. The girl replies that it was actually because of the maintenance costs, so they thought it was better to leave its care to a third party. But the beach's previous owners apparently had a shady past and now had no choice but to auction off the beach. But even so, Lin wasn't the actual owner. He would only be its proprietor for 70 years, and after that, the contract would have to be renewed. Then, he asks if he should negotiate with the Mumbai manager for its future use, and she replies yes and also gives him their location. After that, he decides to call one of his employees, asking him what he knew about Mumbai Beach. The young man mentions that the place was somewhat problematic, not to mention they still owed more than 200,000 to Lin's company. Hearing this, he ordered the young man to gather all the paperwork on the debts they owed, and said that they would go collect them immediately to sort this out. Arriving there, the place looked like a normal company. They were soon greeted by 2 of the company's thugs, asking what brought them there, remarking that they had walked right in. The young man says he was looking for their manager, but according to the thugs, he wasn't there, as they tried to deceive the protagonist and his assistant. But since the manager's car was still there, he didn't believe what the henchman said. He also introduces the protagonist as the new owner of the Banya terminal and Mumbai Beach, so this visit wasn't just because they owed money. After hearing this, the henchman's expression changed completely, saying that they would take them to their boss's office. But the protagonist lost his patience and threw the documents at them, then saying that they would not be going to the office. Therefore, they were to tell their boss to pull his men out of Mumbai Beach, not to mention that they had to pay what they owed him as soon as possible, telling them not to disturb their peace over such a trivial matter. After that, the henchmen go to their boss's office, telling him what had recently happened and relaying the message the protagonist left for them. However, the man who was the boss there, named Lin Yi, was annoyed with what his henchmen had just told him. Upon hearing that he was also the owner of the boat terminal, he was struck by his attitude. When one of the men there comments that apparently, the other side didn't want to show their face much, the true owner of the beach says he would go in the next day to put an end to the protagonist's business. After this, Lin went to the Peninsula Hotel to find out about the debts, and the general manager asks him when he would like to review the accounts, and that he will soon send someone to prepare the papers. However, Lin then asks if the Peninsula Hotel has any unpaid debts that the manager has been unable to collect. He then replies that there are indeed some unpaid debts, totaling approximately 3 million. So, the protagonist asks why the manager hadn't mentioned this before, but he replies that it was a complicated matter to address, as the people who owed them were people they couldn't afford to mess with. Upon checking more closely who owed them, he discovered that Kim's name was also on the list. The manager, seeing that Lin was going to call young Kim, began to panic, saying his family was not someone to be trifled with, not to mention that young Kim had brought some girls there the night before and they still hadn't paid, so they were possibly still at the hotel. As soon as Kim answers, the protagonist mentions the debt he owed the Peninsula Hotel for the amount of $118,000. But the young man asks why Lin cared about that if he wasn't the owner of the Peninsula Hotel. However, he replies that he was indeed the owner of the hotel and that if he paid him now, Lin would let him stay there for free. Hearing that the protagonist was there, he couldn't believe it and began to prepare to meet Lin quickly. An employee appears, saying that a man named Lin Yi was at the reception, wanting to speak with young Lin. Speak of the devil. He appeared with a possible gift and his henchmen as well. When the security guard saw that many people in the protagonist's room, he notified the head of security to gather all the hotel's security guards outside on the ground and floor and wait for his call. After that, the guy who owed the protagonist tossed a gift on the table, saying it was a small gesture of appreciation, as they would do great things in the future, but at no point did the protagonist say he would like to do business with him. The debtor then mentions that he had come to see the protagonist personally and couldn't believe he was received with such a look. Furthermore, he said he would clear things up, and if they didn't reach an agreement that very day, the protagonist wouldn't be able to do business in the future. Since he didn't have a very good life, he told the protagonist they should enjoy their time and see who would come out worse from all this. Realizing this was a threat, Lin made the guy slam his head on the table, even breaking the cup that was there. When his henchmen also went after the protagonist, with just one kick, he managed to knock one of them unconscious, sending him flying into the wall. Shortly after, the debtor then tells Lin not to be a fool, but the protagonist decided to send him a message, saying he knew about all the nasty things they were always up to. Besides, he not only owned the beach and the terminal, but also the hotel, and all the security personnel downstairs were his employees. Only when the suspicious guy checked the window to see the number of security guards waiting, did he realize that Lin was not a person to be messed with. Since the guy in front of him knew the underworld better than the protagonist, he mentions that as long as he paid people to do what he wanted, the debtor could already imagine what might happen to him. Afterward, young Kim also arrives, asking what they were doing there, showing that he knew them. The guy who owed the protagonist started saying that they had a problem with Lin regarding some business matters and was asking for his help. But Kim asks the protagonist directly what was going on and if those guys were really worthy of talking business with him. When they realized the friendship the two of them had, they didn't know how to react at that moment. Then, Lin repeats what the young man said, stating that they were going to ruin his business. After that, Kim asks who the idiot was that had said that. According to Kim's analysis, it couldn't be the one in black clothes, as he wouldn't have the guts to do it, so that only left the opportunist from before. According to Kim, not even he was worthy of talking business with Lin, so he ordered them to get out of there immediately, even causing the henchmen to ask who the protagonist was to have such authority, but Kim quickly ordered them again to get out of the place immediately. But before that, Lin asked if they were going to pay him what they owed, and they replied that they would come back with the money and would definitely pay everything they owed. Then Kim asked the protagonist if he'd like him to send someone to teach them a lesson, but according to him, it wasn't necessary, since they were just a bunch of people not worth his time. Since he had just helped Lin, the young man proposed that he forget the 100,000 debt he had with him, but the protagonist asks if he had no shame, but according to Kim, those who do business can't have that sort of thing, convincing Lin to let his debt be settled. After this, he received a call from the Divine Lady, asking if he was busy, but he replies that he had quit his job. She asked if he had really been fired for winning over a student, impressed by the rumors she'd heard about him. He simply replies that he liked to experience life. So after the experience, he just switched jobs and was now working as a delivery man. She then decides to place her order and he responds, saying that he couldn't refuse an order from her. At that moment, poor Kim was left all alone, annoyed, because the protagonist had completely ignored him. I confess that I felt a little sorry for him here, since he really seemed to see Lin as a friend, but it seems he was the only one who thought so. Soon, he went to meet the Divine Lady, and she praised him for being quick with his delivery, but he says that calling a man fast wasn't really a compliment, leaving her somewhat embarrassed or perhaps simply not knowing how to respond to that. When he asks if she wants him to take those things to her house, she replies that it's not necessary, because that place also had a kitchen, and from time to time, when she needed it, she would ask the chef to open the kitchen for her. When she said she was going to show him her cooking skills again, he decided to take matters into his own hands, saying that she didn't have to worry, since he didn't want to eat steak that day. Since the wisdom of the sages also included skills in the kitchen, he decided to give it a try. We see that his skills were truly at a professional level with these images, and, a few minutes later, the feast was completely ready for them to try. Even without tasting it, the Divine Lady was already completely charmed by the menu, and her desire to dig in was also great. Moreover, she ended up praising him for his skills, since just from the smell, everything seemed very good. Hearing this, he asked her to start then and, in the meantime, he would bring her some juice. When he went to get the juice, he ended up hearing a scream coming from where he left the Divine Lady and asks what had happened. But, apparently, she was just impressed with the taste of his food, not to mention that it was better than any meal from a 5-star restaurant she had ever tasted. And she also asks him how he was so good at cooking. He just plays it cool, saying he didn't know, and could only say that he was a talented young man. According to the Divine Lady, she was even gaining weight and was also getting out of breath. However, changing the subject, she asked what kind of reward he would like. but I think his actions already showed it, rather than just saying it. However, just in case there was still any doubt in her head, he said he already had his reward right in front of him. After that, he asks why she had called him that morning, wondering if something had happened. She replies that it was nothing serious. She just wanted him to go with her to see the Banja terminal that afternoon. It's undeniable that it saddens me to see her giving her heart to him, but he isn't doing the same, and is still looking for a way to cheat. However, putting the sadness aside, he says he would go with her that afternoon to see the project's progress. At this moment, we get a view of how the port is turning out. She mentions that the estimated cost of the renovation would be around 300 million, more or less, and since she wouldn't want him to spend too much money, the Divine Lady says she could save up to 1.5 billion, but he asks why, since he duly had that amount. The goddess replies saying that his project was very large, and she really didn't want him to spend all that money, so he could save it in case a setback or an emergency situation occurred at a critical moment. He even understood her concern, but said she didn't need to worry about it, as he wouldn't be doing any of this if he didn't have the proper money to invest. With that, she had no more excuses and said she would do as he wished then. After that, the Divine Lady says that she had analyzed the design groups and that it would be perfect if Mumbai Beach could be included in the renovation plan. Since things were quite simple for him, he just says that all they had to do was buy the beach then. But the lady asked him if he thought he could just buy the beach just because he wanted to, especially since the beach was government property, apparently, or something like that, and there was nothing he could do. This time, joking with him, she ended up playing along with his game, and he simply agreed with what the beautiful lady had said. He then comments that it wouldn't be fun to wear a bikini in a private pool, so it was better to sunbathe on the beach. Besides, she also says she thought someone would challenge him, referring to the protagonist, but apparently she had overestimated him. As soon as one of Lin's employees noticed his presence, he ran over to him to report, also saying that Eldon Lai had paid the money he owed them and that the business on that side of Mumbai Beach was officially his now. This left the beautiful lady speechless, asking what they were talking about and if Mumbai Beach was now his. He replies, happy as a clam, saying that what she had said was true, and asks her if she wouldn't like to sunbathe as she had said before, to which she replies that he was very annoying and was always setting traps for her, and, fortunately for him, she always fell for his tricks. We continue with the beautiful lady discussing something with her boyfriend, saying that now that the Wanyang terminal was all his, he could take her out to sea, to have some fun when he had time. Of course, he replies that he accepted her offer and would bring the equipment to the location to teach her how to dive. After that, she mentions that he wanted to create a foundation and that she had contacted some people for him. These people could handle the paperwork, and if he had no requirements for the location, she could get him a good spot. While holding his beautiful lady's hands, he said that she could help him with the paperwork. And as for the location, it could be in the Linjin building, which, if I remember correctly, were the twin towers he had acquired. Then, she asked him if he hadn't bought the building as well, and he ended up admitting, this time, that yes, he had bought the building too. Since she had to go to work, he asked her to be careful on her way home, but she told him he should also take care, and they finally say their goodbyes. Right after saying goodbye, he received a new order to buy 2 floaties for girls for 200 each, regardless of the brand. As soon as he arrived at the shop selling the floaties, he placed his order with the owner, who offered the protagonist a floatie that cost 209, and he accepted and asked the clerk to give him a receipt as well, since he was a delivery driver and needed to present one at the end of each delivery. Shortly after, the seller mentioned that a company's main business is to offer variety and good products to its customers, and he asked the protagonist if he would like to be introduced to some rich women that the seller knew. This made Lin suspicious of the seller's side businesses, but he soon handed over what the protagonist had come to buy, and we finally see him leaving to make his delivery. Arriving at the beach, he called the young man who had placed the order earlier so they could meet somewhere for the delivery. However, the young man said he didn't have much time right now and that Lin should bring the floaties to a large red sun umbrella, but since the beach was full of these umbrellas, he found himself completely lost among so many people. However, the young man who placed the order, he soon arrived with his friends to receive the package, but you could already see that the girl from before was charmed by the protagonist. She then went to call her friend, so she could see the hottie who was making the delivery for them. As soon as the other girl saw Lin, she immediately agreed with what her friend had said and asked why he was making deliveries if he was already so handsome. But apparently, the young man ended up feeling the bitter taste of rejection and didn't like it at all. Then he said some negative things about our protagonist, but the girls already realized it was just envy, since the protagonist had an attractive appearance and this woman's store was looking for salespeople. She thought he perfectly met the requirements to work there. As he had successfully delivered their order, he told them the price for the 2 floats and asked them to check them as well. The pink-haired girl then asked if he had any intention of changing jobs and mentioned the clothing store she owned, and that she would like someone like him to manage it, but he replied that he wasn't very interested, and soon he asked which of them was going to pay for the floats. Soon we will see an insignificant brat annoyed with life just because the floats were slightly above the price he had actually requested, and furthermore, he accused the protagonist of pocketing the difference. As if the previous accusation wasn't enough, he also said that Lin was forging receipts and had bought a cheaper float than what he had asked for. As the billionaire that he is, our protagonist asked if the young man thought Lin was short on money, since that amount was nothing to him. Clearly, this made the boy angry, saying that Lin seemed quite confident and asked if he thought he was richer than the despicable young man. But the girl told him to forget all that and that she would pay for the floats. Since it was the ungrateful one who had invited the girls, he refused to let her pay for anything. Therefore, he decided to give the money to Lin. However, as soon as he received the amount in his hands, he realized that he had only been given 400, and 18 were still missing, since both floats came to 209. However, the scoundrel soon said that it had nothing to do with him, and even claimed he had told Lin to buy the floats for 200 and wasn't going to pay the extra money that had been spent. The blue-haired rattlesnake was apparently on the simpleton's side, as she was apparently his lapdog. Then, the protagonist hands the money to the beautiful lady with pink hair, who by the way was not toxic like the one next to her, and he told her that, since her friends didn't have much money, she should consider the floats a gift to her, and he wished the young woman a good day. But as soon as he turned to leave, the idiot from before got angry because Lin had implied he was poor and, moreover, he bragged, saying that his company earned more than 2 million a year. Upon hearing this, the protagonist said that at least he wouldn't be so stingy over just a few yuan, which was their currency. The young man from before decided to play a trick on the protagonist, saying there was one more thing he'd like to buy, and asked if he would dare to accept his request. However, since there was nothing in the world he wouldn't dare to accept, the beautiful lady ended up saying that it was better for Lin not to bet with the simpleton, as he probably couldn't win, but the toxic anaconda asked whose side she was on, leaving the young woman not knowing how to answer the insignificant question from the girl. When Lin decided to check the order that the young man from before had made for him, at first he was speechless. However, we soon see that the young man's order was for him to buy a Ferrari 812, and the toxic suck-up said he would give him the money as soon as he arrived with the car. You can already see that these two venomous individuals make the perfect pair, just a couple of insignificant scum, but Lin still accepting the order and said that he would bring him the Ferrari. The jerk from before then offered a drink to the beautiful lady who defended the protagonist earlier, but she refused to accept anything from him at that moment. Soon it was the anaconda's turn, saying that it was all just for fun and asking why she had that expression on her face, but she replied that she found his previous attitude too ruthless and that it wasn't necessary. When the fool saw that she was defending the self-respecting Sigma, he was surprised that his friend would do that. Speaking of the supreme alpha male, the superior man himself, he then arrived with a briefcase full of documents. The toxic young man soon went to greet the protagonist, asking how he dared to have the courage to come back there, and that he wouldn't make things too difficult for Lin. He just had to call him boss 3 times and this whole mess would be over. But he ended up receiving a warning from the beautiful young woman who earned my respect, who said that he didn't know when to stop, and was already crossing the line by humiliating the young protagonist. But the anaconda, an affiliate of the little one with the flaming trident, defended the scum from before, telling her friend who the simp from before was, and the power he possessed. However, the beautiful woman couldn't just stand by while he threatened people like that. Right after hearing all this, Lin dropped all the documents that were inside the briefcase from before and ordered the people from the truck to bring the young man what he had ordered, thus showing the Ferrari 812, exactly the same one he had ordered from Lin a short time ago. And then he asked him a question, since he was such a rich kid, if he could really afford to pay for that car. However, he soon admitted that he didn't have enough money to pay for it, and then mentioned the fact that he wanted to bet but lost. So the protagonist just wanted him to kneel 3 times for him and everything would be settled. Outraged at losing, he said he would accept defeat that time, but he'd like to see how Lin would handle the next problem he was about to create. Furthermore, the young man asks Lin if he had heard the name Dom on that side of Mumbai Beach, but he pretended to know nothing, already imagining what was about to come. Then, the scoundrel makes a call to Dom, saying he offered 100,000 to bring people who could help him solve a problem. After the call, the toxic person who didn't know when to stop told Lin to wait, since Brother Dom would arrive in a few minutes. The beautiful lady then told Lin that since he didn't go to that place often, it was better for him to leave because he wouldn't be able to fight against the people that the simp from before had called. But he replies, saying that it was fine. A short time after the fool's call, we see that the people who were taught a lesson by Lin earlier went to the young man, and he soon showed them who. The guy who was bothering him was saying he needed their help. The kid started to think too highly of himself and said that he'd like to see how long the protagonist could maintain that arrogant face when Lin asks if the young man thought that, bringing them, that they would help him there in some way. We see that the guys who had just arrived were completely surprised to see Lin again. Furthermore, they soon showed due respect to our protagonist, leaving the young man from before, unaware of what was really happening. While they were trying to kick Lin out of Mumbai, he mentioned that it had been less than a day, and they were already causing trouble again. He then asked if they had ignored his previous words. However, their leader quickly began to apologize to Lin, saying that they were in the wrong. The foolish young man kept asking what was going on, and he soon got a good kick for it. The guy who thought he was there to teach Lin a lesson ended up revealing that the protagonist was actually the owner of the entire Mumbai beach and also of the only jam terminal. And since the young man still dared to cause trouble there, he had apparently given up on living. This left both of the girls from before completely stunned by this news. After teaching the previous scum a lesson, Don asked how Lin would like them to handle the problem, saying they would do anything. Lin then replied that he didn't want much. Since the young man had wanted to kick him out, he only wanted the toxic guy to kneel before him 3 times and call him boss. Upon hearing this, they asked the guy if he would need help doing so, and one of them said that 3 times wouldn't be enough to punish the scum for his sins, but it didn't take long for the young man to kneel and do as Lin had previously requested. After that, the protagonist said he would let it slide this time. Moreover, he also told the young men that if in the future they didn't have enough to eat, they could look up a person he knew, and he would get them a job. Clearly, they thanked the protagonist profusely. The beautiful lady from before said she'd like to leave, but since she hadn't come in a car, she asked if he could give her a ride. In the end, he agreed to take the girl, but asked if it wouldn't be better for her to change first, especially since it wasn't appropriate for her to be in a bikini. But she said it was fine and, as it was a very hot day, it would be cooler. The toxic girl came up next, also asking if she could go with them since she hadn't brought her car either, but Lin said that the motorcycle only had room for 1 person and that if she really wanted a ride, she should get in that truck and the driver would take her. As soon as the girl got on his motorcycle, he felt an overwhelming pressure from behind, pushing him forward, if you know what I mean. This time, it was the system girl's turn to appear in a bikini, saying that he had completed 3 orders and received 3 5-star reviews. Thus, his career completion was at 40% and his reward was 1 billion, in addition to unlocking a new mission. And since he received a good reward, he also gave a reward to the system lady. As soon as he saw the amount being deposited into his account, the girl with him accidentally ended up seeing the sum of 1,500,000,000 in the protagonist's account, shocking her with the amount he possessed. A short time later, she mentions that she had accidentally seen the balance in his account, which she thought was 150 million, and says that not even her clothing store's account had a fraction of his money. But he says she must have misread it and that it was actually 1,500,000,000, leaving her completely stunned and thinking she had hit the jackpot, some kind of divine blessing. As soon as he arrives at her clothing store, we see the beautiful, well-dressed lady, and he asked if that store was hers. Then, she replies that she had a degree in fashion design from Dongsua University, and asks if he would like to have a drink. Since he still had some things to do, he had to politely decline, and said he would take one of her business cards. She then told him that he didn't need to take the card, and that he could simply add her on social media platforms. But he didn't mean that. Rather that his company might need some uniforms in the future, and when the time came, he would place some orders with her, and she clearly said it would be a great pleasure to serve him. As soon as he leaves the store, Lin gets a call from an old classmate, saying he was going to Shanghai in a few days. Since the young man hadn't seen the protagonist in half a year, he missed him a lot, and this made Lin find his friend's behavior suspicious. The protagonist's friend then asks if he knew Cisco, a company that manufactured chips like his. Furthermore, the young man said they had solved a problem in the control unit that would allow them to make a leap 10 times greater in the field of domestic chips, and that he was going to talk to him about business at that moment. But Lin said he couldn't talk to him for a while, and that as soon as he arrived, he should contact the protagonist, and he would welcome the young man. After hanging up the phone, Lin quickly got on in his motorcycle to go to the research institute he owned. In his thoughts, we see him say that he had created the source code base a few days ago, and that it made no sense for Cisco to be one step ahead in development. As soon as he arrives, we see the beautiful researcher from before, and she was surprised that he was there all of a sudden. Then, he replies, saying he was there to see how they were doing, and she says that the control unit program was complete. However, there was a small problem with one of the frequencies, or something like that. A short time later, he arrived at the place where the lead researcher was also and tells him what he had recently heard about Cisco, that they had developed a control unit program. This news left them both completely speechless. Upon hearing what Lin had said, he also says that, from what he knew, Cisco had made great progress, because they had hired a specialized technician, and this person was precisely Lu Shu, whom Lin had fired when he took over the research institute. Clearly, they were surprised to hear that their former teammate was now on the competitor's side, but the girl from before told Lin not to worry, as she knew in his skills and could guarantee that there were flaws in his programming. But Lin commented that, apparently, that girl was lacking some knowledge, and asked her who she thought the market would believe. He also asked if she had applied any patents or anything like that. The girl, at a loss realizing the mistake she had made, asked if it would do any good to register the patent now before publishing it. However, Lin replied that the initiative was no longer in their hands, and they had surely already registered it. When the time came, they would simply be the laughingstock of the entire industry. This left the poor girl from before completely shocked, thinking that it would possibly be the end of her career at that moment. But soon, the old man from before said it was his fault. So if they had to fire someone, it should be him instead of his colleague. However, Lin responds by saying there was no reason to fire them, plus he could make up for that loss. So they shouldn't worry, since it was already in the past. The old man then said it was their responsibility, as they were careless enough, and to let their rivals take advantage of them. However, the protagonist soon stood up and told them to get to work, leaving them both wondering what he was talking about. Although Cisco had stolen their technology, that was just version 1.0. Therefore, it was time to create an improved and even more complete version than the last one. They said they would do everything possible to help him with this. Soon, he embodied the spirit of wisdom within him and began to produce a new program or something, leaving both of them there impressed with their boss's skills. This time, it took a little over 12 hours for the process to be fully completed, and he was also completely exhausted. Not to mention that, according to him, if he kept programming, he would end up going bald. After finishing everything, Lin said they would need to find a way to get Dutch lithography machines, and this would be their priority from now on. Soon, the old man said he would make some calls and resolve that matter as soon as possible. But when Lin mentioned the girl from before, she was afraid of what would come next as punishment. But he just told her to develop a new portable system as soon as possible and that he needed a system that was not inferior to Apple's. Proudly, she said she would do as he asked and that he shouldn't worry, as she would complete the task he gave her at all costs. With a hug, he ended up motivating his employees to work even more diligently, and also said that they could truly change the history of the chip monopoly in foreign countries. Furthermore, the future would be a new chapter for them. After that, the protagonist decided to leave and let his employees work on their research, and both were surprised by Lin's kindness, even thinking that their country had a promising future. This time, Lin was in his Pagani, which many here say was a Ferrari, and I don't even know which is which, but I'll keep calling it a Pagani. He received a new order on his app, clearly went quickly to make his delivery, and didn't take long to reach his destination. But apparently this would be another troublesome customer, as he had seen a 50% discount at the store, and thought what he had ordered would be cheaper than the final price. However, Lin replies that the promotion he had seen before actually happened the day before. This guy also thought the protagonist was making a profit above the actual value, but he said he had a receipt right there and it was only a few hundred yuan, so he wasn't trying to trick him or anything. Soon, a lady appears saying it was fine, since it was only a few hundred yuan, and just asked her husband not to cause trouble for people. Then, the husband says goodbye to his wife to go to his night shift, and as the protagonist was leaving, the scoundrel told him to take out the trash as if he had any obligation to do the scoundrel's chores. Speaking of obligation, that's exactly what Lin said, that he had no obligation to do that. The guy from before ended up threatening Lin, saying he wouldn't give him a 5-star review if he didn't help him, and that he would also complain about him, but he continued to ignore the scum and said he could do whatever he wanted. But before Lin could leave, the guy continued saying he would complain about him, but he was completely ignored by our self-respecting Sigma, As soon as the protagonist left the building, he came across a worker collecting trash on the street, thinking that it was really hard work. Besides, the young man was practically dying carrying a table that was twice his size, and Lin, seeing that scene, decided to help the young worker. At that moment, we discovered that this young man was actually a delivery driver just like Lin, and he asked if the young man couldn't just refuse some orders, but he said no, and that if he didn't get a good review, half a day's work would be for nothing. According to the young man, few customers like Lin help, but he said they weren't customers, but that they made deliveries just like the young man. Then, the scumbag from before appeared again, asking why he hadn't left yet. Furthermore, he kept talking about Lin's 5 stars and that he would complain about him as always. But the protagonist said he didn't care much, because he didn't want to be bossed around by inferior beings like him. This ended up making the guy completely irritated, and he called the protagonist arrogant and smelly, conceited for being a sales manager at a chemical company. Moreover, the guy said he could pay for the protagonist with his car, and Lin asked if he had gone crazy enough to wreck a 1.6, but as soon as Lin showed off the beautiful sports car he had with him, it made the guy reconsider his recent attitudes. He asked Lin why he worked as a delivery driver if he was so rich, but he replied that it was his right to experience life, and since he had said he was a sales manager at a chemical company, Lin said that if he continued treating people that way, his end would probably come very soon, especially since he was also in that field. And this made the scoundrel from before get on his knees, completely changing his arrogant attitude from before, saying he would never do something like what he did that day again. After all this trouble, Lin received a new order where he basically had to buy emergency contraceptive medication. But as soon as he saw that order, he felt that this delivery would also be exhausting. But he still went to the location to make the delivery he had just received. However, as soon as the person opens the door, he couldn't believe it was precisely the girl he disliked the most, exactly the same person who had humiliated him a short time ago, his former schoolmate. She asked why he was making deliveries. He then asked what was wrong with that and gave the final price for the delivery. However, the girl started to think that Lin had lost all his money and now the only thing left for him to do was make deliveries. However, he replied that he was sure that whatever he did or didn't do, it certainly didn't matter to her, so he'd be on his way as soon as she paid him. But that wasn't enough, and the girl continued to try and humiliate Lin in every way possible, saying he could never do business with his skill level and other things as well. After that, she threw the contraceptive medication on the floor, saying she didn't want it anymore, and that she wanted to return the order. However, he simply ignored all of that and told her not to regret it later, since a child might be on the way. Since the little venomous anaconda had nothing better to do with her life, she told Lin that she was going to take some pictures of him. As soon as he asked the reason she was doing all this, she said it was because he had completely failed in his business. She had to share that news with her classmates. Suddenly, the general manager of the Peninsula Hotel appears, asking the girl to take the pills immediately, but when he sees his boss in front of him, he asks what Lin was doing there. The toxic girl then started saying that he was her former classmate, who had made a lot of money but lost it all recently, and now was making deliveries. But this made the general manager teach the girl a lesson, asking how she dared to tarnish Lin's image like that, then saying that he would wipe her off the face of the earth. She then asked why he was doing this, since Lin was bankrupt and couldn't compete with him. However, the general manager quickly said that he was just experiencing life and asked her to stop acting like an ignorant person. Quickly, the general manager began to apologize to Lin on the girl's behalf, and he simply said that it was okay, but asked him to keep that girl away from him in the future, and also asked for the 5 stars on the app. As soon as he left the place, he received the review he had asked for, and we see the general manager continuing to teach the rattlesnake a lesson, saying that because of her stupidity, she had almost ruined his business. As that order had been very quick, only one more day was left, and he would complete the professional mission. He then received a call from the Supreme Goddess who asked him to come to her house, if he was free, and to make her something good to eat, and he said he would be at her house in no time. However, the Divine Lady asked him to meet her at the supermarket, as she didn't have any ingredients at her house. Upon arriving, we see a completely stunning, angelic being, and she soon showed a beautiful smile upon seeing her boyfriend. She mentions that she had heard he had opened a supermarket there, and since he was a diamond rank member at that place, they would probably get a discount on their purchases. After that, they finally entered the supermarket to buy some ingredients, but at one point he asked if they were there to buy food. When she answers yes, he asks why she had grabbed so many cakes and desserts. So, with that, she said that a woman's mood depended a lot on a good dessert and insisted they go shopping. but he asked if her good mood wasn't actually because of him, and let's just say that ended up embarrassing her. With the protagonist's comment, we continue with the protagonist doing his shopping with the divine lady, and, from his expression, you could already see that he wasn't happy about it at all, but apparently he would have to wait a little longer, as the beautiful lady still wanted to buy more meat since she fell in love with the dish he prepared for her a few days ago. Suddenly, an older man arrives, wanting to talk to the beautiful lady, saying that he was an entertainment talent scout and asked if she wasn't interested in getting into that business. Furthermore, he offered her his personal number, saying she was very beautiful and would certainly be a great success in that field. However, she quickly shot the guy down, saying that she wasn't interested, and told him to ask the fishmonger if she would accept, since she was also good-looking. But we see that she really wasn't like Lin, he had actually said. After that, the guy said that the protagonist couldn't interfere in the beautiful lady's affairs, and guaranteed that she would succeed in that field, and mentioned that an actor currently earns more than 100 million a year. She took this opportunity to tease our protagonist a bit, saying that an annual income of 100 million had piqued her interest a little, and you could see that she got what she wanted. The talent scout said that if Lin truly loved his girlfriend, it was better for him to let her follow her goals, and he replied that was true, but only in 15 years. Not knowing why he had said that, the guy started to wonder why he had said only in 15 years. To clear up the guy's doubts, the protagonist said he had 1.5 billion in his account. Therefore, he wanted to book her for 15 years, and that was if the guy still wanted to wait for her. Seeing the enormous amount of zeros in the protagonist's account, the young man started to break out in a cold sweat, as he couldn't imagine he was dealing with a high-class big shot, and told him to contact him again in 15 years. After that, he started to apologize, saying he shouldn't be making such a fool of himself, and finally decided to leave, giving the protagonist and the divine lady some peace and quiet. Again, the beautiful lady started to laugh at the protagonist and joked with him a bit, asking if he could make an advance payment of 100 million, and he replies that the deposit could be made. However, he would like to see the issue through that night no matter what happened. Clearly, she had no way to respond to such a provocation and simply tried to stay calm, but she also told him that when he got home, she would see what was up. After hearing this, he mentioned something about 300 rounds and seeing if she would have that much energy, and since she felt challenged, she swore to herself that she would make it. Upon arriving at the divine lady's house, he asked her if she was really sure that her parents weren't home. She replied that she was and asked since when he had become so shy. He answered that, in fact, it was because he had already seen her parents so many times that meeting them at that moment, it would be too embarrassing. Then, she asks if he was ashamed and comments that she thought he was getting thinner every day, so soon a simple gust of wind could blow him away, and mentioned that she hadn't settled the score with him yet since the incident at the supermarket. So, he soon suggested they finish the 300 rounds mentioned earlier, and she was clearly prepared to make him pay for his crimes. In this part, I'll have to cut some things out, but let's just say they took a moment to eat some grapes, and I think he had the chance to be well taken care of by the divine lady, and this left her completely embarrassed by what he had just done. Since the guy is trained in this art, he didn't even show any insecurity or shame. Before they could continue, she mentioned that when the foundation's formalities are completed, she would seek 10 million in funding, which is the value estimated to support her project, and she would arrange for him to meet the people responsible for the foundation and asked if the next day at noon was okay. To get out of the paperwork and the boring part, he quickly said that she could schedule it, but he was really excited to start the 300 rounds he had mentioned before. The next day, we see the beautiful lady telling him not to forget their meeting that day, and he asked her not to worry about it, as he wouldn't forget. They finally say their goodbyes to go to their jobs, and, by the way, this time he was driving a Ferrari that he had bought a short time ago. After that, he looked at his cell phone and saw the new order, but it said not to buy anything and simply go to the marked location. Upon arriving there, he realized something strange was happening, and wondered what was going on for the guy to have called so many people, thinking that possibly the guy just wanted the delivery drivers to help him move his car that had gotten stuck. The guy is so unscrupulous that he was doing a live stream and, according to him, he had called 6 delivery drivers to help him get his car out, and, on top of that, he said that's how rich people think. This is truly someone who will never succeed in life. Speaking of a rich person, the protagonist appeared next, asking how he could think like a rich person, acting in such a ridiculous way. Then, the scoundrel started to rush the protagonist, saying that he was the only one missing, and said that if they managed to get his car out of there, he would give them a 5-star review. However, the protagonist mentioned that he needed to find a few more people and that just the 6 of them there wouldn't be enough for that. The insect then asked if they didn't lift weights and said that Lin was just trying to be lazy. This ended up infuriating him with the useless guy, and he decided to leave, as he saw it would be a complete waste of time and a headache as well. The useless guy replied by saying that if he continued with that attitude in his job, in 10 years he would still just be a delivery driver. However, a short time later they heard the roar of a sports car's engine, and the insect from before was astonished by the Ferrari that was right in front of him. He then told the delivery drivers that the person in the car had a wealth mindset, and in the near future, that would be his position as well, or at least that's what he thought, until he saw our protagonist and, from his expression, you could see he regretted treating him in such a rude way before. Lin then asks the scoundrel if he was surprised to see him once again, and also said that if he kept thinking the way he thought a rich person thought, he would never be truly rich. After telling him to stop spouting nonsense pretending to be a successful person. After that, he realized that something strange was happening with his live stream, and it really happened as the protagonist had said, and now he was going to be ruined in a few seconds for pretending to be someone he wasn't really. Then, we see him meeting up with the divine lady, and he asked her where the people she had mentioned were, since it was noon and they still hadn't arrived. But she, with a beautiful smile on her angelic face, told him to look behind him and, upon doing so, he realized he was in front of a kitchen and everything was already set up, and for him to just finish making the dish. Seeing that, he told the beautiful lady that he had already made her dinner the day before, and asked if she now wanted him to make her lunch as well. In response, she assured him that when she learned how to cook, she would cook for him every day with a beautiful smile and a proposal as lovely as that. He had no way of refusing and quickly prepared the dishes for them, and apparently, they were ready to enjoy the meal. After that, she heard someone knock on the door and asked the person to come in. At that moment, we see a girl named Wan, who called the Divine Lady sister, accompanied by Kishan Xiao. Then, she asked if they weren't supposed to meet until 2 in the afternoon, so she saw no reason for the girl to be there so early. But according to the young woman, she didn't want to be late to meet her new boss. Then, the girl commented that the beautiful lady had found a very handsome chef for the kitchen and was learning from him. Upon hearing this, Miss G asked Wan if he looked like a chef, and she replied that because he was so handsome, he certainly wasn't a chef, and asked if he was her new secretary then. Just as the divine lady was about to reveal who he really was, the protagonist ended up winking at her so she wouldn't reveal who he truly was. Still, Wan then said that her sister didn't need to explain anything, and wanted to introduce the young man, Xiao, whom she had met during an exchange program in the United States, also mentioning that the young man had great business skills. When the divine lady greeted the young man, she asked if he had eaten anything yet, and also if they would like to join them for the meal. Since an offer like that couldn't be refused, we see that they quickly finished the dishes the protagonist had just made. According to Wan, the protagonist's food was so good that she got full quickly. Furthermore, the young man said he didn't imagine that he also knew about the chip industry, as he had mentioned, saying that Lin was a truly incredible person. The young woman mentioned that it was already 3 in the afternoon, and that her new boss still hadn't arrived, then saying that apparently he didn't have a very good sense of time. At that moment, the divine lady coughed, saying that their new boss had actually been there for a long time. This left the girl confused, since she hadn't seen him yet, but the beautiful lady finally introduced the protagonist, saying that he was the founder of the Lin Foundation. Judging by their reaction, they had no idea that he was the very person they had. I've been looking for all this time. After that, Wan began to apologize, as she didn't mean to call him a cook just a moment ago, but he told her not to worry, and now that they knew who he really was, they could ask him whatever they wanted. Seizing this opportunity, she asked if his upcoming business would have the foundation as its main focus and what his business plan was. In response, he said the foundation wasn't the main focus of his future business, and asked if they would believe him if he said that he actually wanted to dominate the entire global business scene. At that moment, a tremendous silence fell over the room, until he asked if they thought he was just joking. The divine lady also commented that any ambitious person was worthy of admiration. Now, looking at the protagonist with admiration, the young man then said that he even had a few questions for him, but after hearing the answer he just gave, he was left speechless. Wan ended up being speechless as well, charmed by the boss, and said that, even though the pie was big, her new boss was still very handsome. And according to her, there was nothing wrong with that, but this comment and her recent facial expression ended up making the divine lady a little jealous. Apparently, she scolded her friend. Since the protagonist was a very generous person, he said that now that the plan had been unveiled, Each of them would receive an annual salary of 5 million, and they would receive dividends when the company went public. Excited by all of that, Joan said it was a classic case of motivating people with money, and it made her feel even more motivated to participate in that business. As for the young man, he was grateful to the protagonist for his generosity and consideration. Besides, for him, that salary was so high that it ended up making him a little embarrassed. According to Lin, money wasn't important, and what really mattered to him was a person's talent. Since they were veterans and wanted to go to war against the world with him, he certainly wouldn't treat them poorly. After a beautiful toast in celebration of this new milestone, both parties took the opportunity to taste some fine wine. After the tasting, Lin said he would take them to the new company's location and leave the future work to them. And Joan said she was looking forward to it, but the divine lady asked if she wasn't actually afraid that Lin would give her a small, dark room, but from the girl's reaction, a small, dark room would be fine with her. At this point, we cut to the building and Joan asked if he had rented an office in the mansion's twin, but when he replied that it wasn't that, she asked if it was in an adjacent building, since there were several high-end office buildings nearby. But he replied that he had actually bought the Twin Towers himself, and once again left his new employees speechless. The girl then started to try and use her charm on the protagonist, saying she no longer wanted to be the CFO and asked if he didn't need a secretary, saying she didn't have long legs like her sisters, but that she could wear a short, silk sheath dress. This comment from the girl made the beautiful lady act and asked if it would be worth sacrificing all that wealth just for a bit of ambition. Joan ended up hugging the divine lady, mentioning that she was jealous over the protagonist. Next, he said that he would leave and the rest of the work to them, and that there were 500 million in the company's fund. Therefore, from now on, they'd be the ones in charge of the business there, since he also had his own work to do. Joan ended up asking what other jobs he had and if he wasn't working as a cook for other company owners, referring to the divine lady. But he ended up pulling his goddess closer and replied that he was actually working as a delivery man now, and we see them having the same reactions as everyone else. The beautiful lady then told them to get going, since Lin wasn't just a rich man and there was still more to see, while Joanne and the young man talked about the division of the company's departments and other things as well. We see the protagonist and the divine lady alone. He asked if they shouldn't transfer the Sonrisa group there, but she said it would depend on whether he had the means, whether to buy it or not. In the end, he ended up playing hardball, saying that he should start by acquiring the company's president first. She asked him if he didn't have a general direction for his development and future planning, like real estate services, and his answer was no, but he believed in big numbers. After that, she asked another question: if he wanted to decide the next step in his development strategy, based on big data and cloud computing, and he answered yes, then saying that what he wanted to do wasn't easy. She gave him a suggestion, saying he could enter as an investor first and create an investment company. After hugging the supreme goddess, he said she was so smart that she had conquered his heart, but she played it cool, saying she didn't know what he was talking about. Furthermore, she said that although Yuan had become her employee, her true identity was still that of the group's chief financial officer. Therefore, he should take advantage of them and use them well, and he replied by telling her not to worry, as they would be a resource that would be used very well. As if that weren't enough, he teased the beautiful lady, asking if she wasn't thinking of a career change, since he was still without a personal secretary. In response, she ended up leaving him breathless, telling him to think bigger and told him to take her home, as she still had a lot of work to do at the office. A while later, we have a scene at the Shanghai airport, and he was mentioning that the Bentley, which had been bought by Shang Changlong, was very good and, apparently, he had finally finished the evaluation task. But suddenly, a great glow began to emanate from his cell phone, until the beautiful system girl appeared, saying that his career progress was already at 60%, and, as a reward, he got a luck card limited to 5 minutes. When he asked what a luck card was, she replied that it was for an extreme case where he might need to change his luck. At the flight terminal, he realized that the flight of Chang Song, his friend from college, was almost arriving, and we see him next to a grumpy girl. Since a long time had passed since they had seen each other, Chang Song ended up hugging his friend, saying that he had missed him a lot. The grumpy girl then asked what he was doing, since they were in an airport and people were staring at his recent behavior. Since he hadn't seen his friends since they graduated, he didn't care much about what people said or thought. After that, he introduced his girlfriend to the protagonist, saying that her family was also from Shanghai, and that she had come with him to see his family. Since they were probably hungry, Lin suggested they go eat something good. But we see that this girl was nothing more than a spoiled rich kid, saying she couldn't eat at the stalls, as it was very unhygienic. But the boyfriend asked what all that was about, since they always ate at the stalls in college. To get out of this situation, she said she had heard that a restaurant had opened nearby in Shanghai and asked why the protagonist wouldn't take them there to try it. But for Chang Song, there was no need for them to go to such an expensive place. We find out at this moment that Chang Song had told his girlfriend that Lin actually earned a lot of money in his real estate company, and, apparently, this scumbag just wanted to take advantage of Lin as much as he could. But he replied that he was no longer in the real estate business and that now he was actually a delivery driver. However, the restaurant was still affordable and he suggested they go there. When Johnson heard what Lin said, he didn't believe it. At first, since he was the best student among all of them in college, he asked why the protagonist didn't wait for him to sort out the things he had to do there and go with him to Yanjin, since he could help him financially. But the poisonous anaconda ended up showing her true colors, saying she wasn't crazy enough to do that, since she wasn't going to support him and that if he still took the protagonist there, she would definitely break up with him. But Lin said it was fine and they could stop fighting, especially since he was doing very well in Shanghai and wasn't going to Yanjin. As soon as they get to the parking lot to pick up the car, and this clueless girl was calling him brother, asking him what he was doing there, he replied that he had just seen a Bentley parked inside and took some pictures to send to his friends, so they would know the reason for his delay, thinking they had disappeared. But, in fact, he ended up running into them in the parking lot, and here we see the protagonist commenting to his friend, saying that, although it wasn't ideal to meddle in family matters, those two really look like siblings. The toxic young man, just like his sister, asked if he hadn't bought a car in Yanjin, and mentioned that his mother would like them to have dinner at her house. Then Johnson said he hadn't bought the car, since like the lazy girl, she didn't want to work, his salary was barely enough to cover expenses. Therefore, the car was unfeasible. The arrogant guy then started getting full of himself, saying that he had worked for 2 years to buy the best of the best, and if he had managed it, he asked why Sun couldn't. Clearly, this ended up leaving the young man embarrassed and dejected after that unnecessary comment. To defend his friend, the protagonist said that his buddy didn't have a car. However, he had one and a car was just a car. And if it was so important, then he would gift one to Sun, and soon they saw the Bentley responding to the protagonist's key, leaving the scoundrel shocked by that. Then Sun asked his friend, also surprised, if that car was really his, and he proudly replied that it was. The treacherous jellyfish asked Sun how he could have a car like that, if, according to the protagonist, he was just a delivery boy. But the young man also had no idea how that was actually possible. The girl then started playing innocent, saying they shouldn't eat at home and that it would be better if they ate together to get to know each other better. But he said they were going to eat at a stall, so she probably wouldn't like it. Her toxic brother had the idea of inviting everyone to dinner, and when they got to know each other better, they would be good friends, the bitter rattlesnake whom I would like to negatively criticize. In other words, she ended up blaming her boyfriend, and since the guy was nothing more than a simp for women, he ended up telling Lin that they should go together. After a bit of silence, he told them to get in the car when it was time to get into the vehicle. We could already see that the jellyfish's brother was good for nothing, and Lin thought that in that family there really were only toxic people. Once inside the car, the bitter girl was impressed with the interior of the Bentley, and her toxic brother was not far behind either, saying that common people couldn't get into an executive class car. After that, he even had the nerve to ask the protagonist to lend him the car, and within a few days, having barely known him. According to him, he needed to go to a friend's wedding, and Lin gave him a terrifying look, asking him who his friends were. That was enough to put the guy in his place, but the Supreme Snake told her brother to just rent a car, since Lin had said he was going to give that car to his. But this guy's attitude really bothered me, and when she said that if he didn't accept the car, they would just break up, he ended up shutting up. Simps like this only suffer in the future, and it seems this one's fate will be no different. After a while, they arrived at the Shunhai food court. Upon entering, Lin commented to his friend that they used to go there all the time in school, and asked if he still remembered it, but apparently he could never forget something like that. Then the simp told his girlfriend to pick something she liked, but according to the scoundrel, she didn't like that smoked food. But while the clownfish was playing hard to get, he was placing his order. After that, he and his friend drank together and he thanked the protagonist for his kindness. And he had a lot to talk about with his friend, but the protagonist asked him to wait until they got to his house where they could talk better. However, he said it wasn't necessary, as the company would reimburse him for lodging. According to the scum of society, it was a great idea for him to stay at Lin's house while she and her brother would go home, but he could still arrange for the reimbursement and earn even more. But he said that wasn't right, and, since Lin also had a girlfriend, it wasn't good for him to be bothering people. But the protagonist said he had broken up with that toxic girl from before a long time ago, and that he now lived alone. so when the time came they would have a second round. After this, a driver suddenly appeared, asking if Lin had called for a driver, and upon answering yes, he said they were going to the Kyushu Pavilion. The toxic siblings then started planning something new, it seems, since that was actually the zone, number 1 residential area in Shanghai. While they were on their way home, the scoundrel told his sister that he had to get into the Kyushu Palace no matter what, and it seems the snake already had a plan to make that happen. The story continues with our protagonist being left outside the car, while the rattlesnake's brother sat in the driver's seat, taking his spot, and the rest settled into the back seat. Clearly, he asked where the space was for the car's owner, since everyone there had already decided on their spots. Then, the treacherous Viper asked him if Chanson was going to stay at his house that night, and comments on the fact that she had said she was going to her family's house, but apparently changed her mind. She replies that she actually wanted to go with the protagonist because her boyfriend was dazed and she was a little worried about him. A pure lie. In reality, she just wanted to take advantage of the multi-millionaire protagonist in front of her when she asks her boyfriend if he would like her to keep him company. The only thing he could do was call his boss, who was the protagonist, and in the end, he just agreed to let them go to his house. Upon arriving there, the rattlesnake was impressed with Lin's Kyushu Pavilion, and his friend comments that the house must have cost a lot of money. Since this protagonist is very humble, the only thing he said was that it didn't cost as much as he thought. Just around 1 billion. If there's one thing this guy isn't, it's humble. After hearing this, they were both completely stunned by the value of the residence, and suddenly, the general manager who looks after the pavilion arrives to welcome his boss, also saying that some things had just arrived for the barbecue, and he would send them directly to the residence. Happily, Lin gives his school friend a hug and comments that it had been a long time since they had a barbecue together, so now that he was sober again they would go for a second round. And of course the guy wasn't going to turn down an offer like that, especially in a house like that. After that, he decided to go get the wine first, and, while he was outside, the Viper struck again. She asked Chanson who his boss was and if he was some low-key rich guy. The young man replies that he was also surprised, especially because he had no idea he had all that money, especially since he acted so normally in college. This anaconda wastes no time and says that since he was so rich, the young man should stick close to him. Furthermore, she had also mentioned that he would give her boyfriend a car and that he should accept it. However, this young man's attitude made me admire him even more, because the guy is a true friend. He replied to that worthless person saying that he could never do that, because it was too expensive a gift to accept. Besides, he was his boss, not his father, so he wasn't automatically obligated to take care of him. That alone was enough to put that toxic, disposable being in her place. But the Cobra doesn't give up easily, and says she realized her boyfriend couldn't stand up for himself, so she would have to do it herself, and according to her, she would make Lin fall at her feet while the barbecue was going on and they were enjoying it. The centipede says she was going to the bathroom because she needed to relieve herself a bit. Get ready for the drama. You can't expect anything good from this treacherous jellyfish. While our respectable protagonist was choosing a good wine to try, the pit viper approached him, wanting to talk to him about something. Basically, she wanted to get cozy with him, but all jokes aside, she comments that our protagonist seems to be single now. He already figured the she-devil was about to start her act, thinking it would probably be adultery or theft. He was already prepared to deal with toxic people like her, especially since it wasn't the first time he had encountered people like that. To shut the non-recyclable being's mouth, he shows a picture of his girlfriend who, by the way, is the most beautiful one so far in this series, without a doubt. Furthermore, he says that she was the president of the Smile Group, which was worth around $1 billion, and asks the rattlesnake if she thought she had someone better in mind. After that, the girl decided to play hardball and asked if he didn't miss having lovers, saying that from the first time she saw him, she fell in love and wanted to be with him. Clearly, this girl still didn't understand the situation she was in by deciding to make such a bold move. But hold on, the situation is about to get worse. At that moment, our protagonist was fighting his instincts, thinking that this wasn't a game, but a direct attack, and, if he wasn't careful, he would end up losing everything. After that display, he tells the jellyfish that her body was nothing special, besides a piece of rotten meat, so it was better for her to save her efforts. The rattlesnake then didn't know where to hide her face after receiving such a sincere compliment from our protagonist, who even added that she disgusted him. Besides, of course, that Viper didn't deserve to be friends with Chanson and commented that the door behind her was the service entrance, so she'd better leave through there immediately. Now that's a true friend. The cobra told him not to overdo it, or else he would regret it. But a guy who had everything at his disposal said he really didn't know what he could possibly regret, especially since the rattlesnake was so far beneath him. Since she no longer had any arguments to use against our protagonist, she started screaming, calling him a pervert. The one who came running to see what was happening was precisely our protagonist's companion. As soon as the young man arrived, she claimed that she had gone to the bathroom and Lin ended up taking advantage of the situation and tried to do something shady. She might not be worth much, but this anaconda knows how to put on a good show. However, since the young man knew his friend and brother, he said it was impossible for that to have happened, especially since he wasn't that kind of person. He then asked if it was possible there had been a big misunderstanding and, in response, the cobra asks if he was her boyfriend or not, and if he was on her side or not. Apparently, the only thing the snake wants is an admirer who doesn't value his own dignity to be her doormat. The girl is so clueless that she says that without 1 billion, Lin couldn't get away with it, but her boyfriend says that was enough and that she was already crossing the line. Then Lin asks if she had some kind of diamond in her, down there, and asked who she thought she was to be able to ask for so much money. This girl seemed to be asking for a beatdown in every way possible, and she even told the protagonist to be careful with his words, because if she posted it on social media it would be bad for him. But Lin responds like a superior being, saying that from the beginning he hadn't touched any part of her body and asked if she really thought that in a house like that, there wasn't a security system. Not knowing what to do now, the disgusting woman decided to turn to her boyfriend, asking him to say something too, but he simply turned his back on a despicable being like her. At that moment, she asked if he didn't love her anymore, and he simply replied that she had done something shameful and still had the audacity to speak to him. After this whole spectacle, the protagonist said the door was behind the disgusting woman, so she'd better leave while he was in a good mood, and so, the human stick ran off not knowing what to do, after being so embarrassed and having lost her boyfriend too. After seeing that his friend went through a very complicated situation, he was asking if he was okay and also apologizing. In response, the heartbroken young man said there was no reason for him to apologize, but that he should actually thank him for what he did, because if it weren't for that, he probably would have never discovered that Viper's true personality and might have been left with nothing one day when she took everything he had achieved. The protagonist then said he was happy that he thought that way and that there was something he would like to talk to him about. While they were enjoying a nice Asian barbecue, the young man said that if he wanted to ask something, he just had to say so, and the protagonist asks him if he knew anything about the Cisco company. He replies that they had recently made a big breakthrough in chip terminal programming, and his boss told him he had to take charge of this project. When the protagonist asks who he had contacted that time, he replies that it was manager Yang Hong-il, but according to him, sales are the responsibility of Vice President Yoon Jin-min. He asks the protagonist why he was asking those questions, and if he had any interest in the sector. However, he replies that he was just curious about one thing and that it was nothing important. Then, he tells his friend that he couldn't be without a car, so it was better for him to keep that one. This is a humble friend. He didn't let the money get to his head, but still, I think giving away a car is too much. The young man decided to kindly refuse Lin's offer, saying he couldn't possibly accept such an expensive car, but Lin simply told him to take the vehicle's key. After that, he comments that he knew the protagonist wanted him to work with him, but he still wanted to try to manage on his own for a while, and if he couldn't do it anymore, then Lin could give him a hand. After seeing that he was truly a real friend, no matter what happened, they decided to make a toast to celebrate their reunion. But the protagonist said he wouldn't let him go home until he was completely wasted. Only then would they end the night the right way, especially after not seeing each other for so long. The next morning, his friend had left him a breakfast plate and a message saying he still had work to do, so he was leaving before him. Seeing that, he thought he needed to get going too, but during his breakfast, he received a sudden order where the only message describing it was about writing essays, leaving him completely unsure of what was actually happening. After that, he decided to call the person who placed the order and comments that he was just a delivery driver and asks if she was sure she wanted him to do the writing, because if he made a mistake on such an important matter, it would undoubtedly affect her graduation grade. However, the young woman replies that he had misunderstood and that it was actually just for him to help her type her paper on the computer. However, she was in a bit of a hurry, so she asked him to come to her address as soon as he could, and as soon as she said that, he was already getting out of his car to head to the location. The scene then cuts to a scene at a maritime engineering school, and we see a handsome young man with a bouquet of flowers who, apparently, was about to confess his feelings to a girl or something like that. Speaking of the girl, She soon appears, and her name is Jing Chao. Then, the guy begins his confession, saying that their graduation was soon and, therefore, he hoped she would be his girlfriend. He tells her that from that moment on, the passenger seat in his car would belong only to her and no one else. As soon as he showed the girl a solitaire ring, her eyes filled with tears, and just as she was about to say yes, the protagonist appears, stealing the whole scene and sending his bouquet flying. He then asks the young couple where the main building of the school was. The girl's attitude changed completely in an instant, saying he just had to go through the school gate, and it was the most prominent building there. As soon as he got out of there, he thanked the young woman for the information she had just provided. The young man asked again if she would agree to be his girlfriend, but with a completely haughty look, she says she refused. And he points out that he thought she was going to say yes just a moment ago, and he asked why she had changed her mind now. She simply replied that his car wasn't good enough for her and that the car the protagonist was in was her final choice, as if she had any right to choose something like that, since she was even more broke than the guy who liked her, considering that apparently, she didn't even have a car. If I were this guy, I would just pretend this materialistic girl didn't exist anymore and move on with my happy life. In a computer lab or something, we see a girl named Lu Wei who couldn't figure something out and was about to give up. The girl was so tired her fingers were numb, which is how I feel when I finish writing my scripts for my videos. Her friend replies that she had no choice but to buy a printed version of the paper with her pocket money. She then asks her friend to hang in there a little longer, saying the delivery guy would be there soon to help them. And by the way, this girl's name is Xiao Wei Ran. Speaking of the protagonist, it didn't take him long to get there, and he asked who Miss Xiao was, saying he was the delivery guy. As soon as he arrived, she told him to sit down, as they were about to start working. She comments that she thought he could finish the process in 4 hours, and he could rest assured she would pay for any overtime he worked. However, as soon as he checked the girl's paper, he realized there were a lot of mistakes in it, and commented that if they handed something like that in, they might not even be able to graduate. However, the girl asked how that was possible, since her classmate who also studied physics had sold it to her, and by the way, he was doing very well in the subject. Clearly, the protagonist found this suspicious because the guy sold her something of terrible quality, and tries to explain to the girl what was wrong with the paper, asking if she understood what he meant now. Not knowing what to do, she asked what she should do now, and he replied that he had a new thesis that could be good for her topic. Basically, she would use Maxwell's demon for the second possibility of doing something that I didn't fully understand. This technical stuff isn't for me, and, speaking of which, not even the girl understood what he had just said. Good thing I'm not alone in this. After that, he started to think of a way to draw it out on paper, since the girls apparently didn't understand a thing. While the young woman was trying to understand what the protagonist was saying, the other girl, behind her, was thinking that it was incredible that a delivery guy could speak so perfectly about topics related to the laws of thermodynamics. Now completely lost and not understanding a thing, the blonde girl just asked him to speak a little more slowly, but apparently, he had already repeated it several times and she still didn't understand a thing, since he had no other choice but to rewrite the paper himself. He just started writing a copy for them. In his thoughts, he wondered if that was what people meant by the phrase the best of the best. 2 hours later, the paper was finished, and he told her to take it to her professor, and there would be no problem at all. However, as always, there has to be some blessed soul to hold people back. This time was no different, and it didn't take long for the jealous guy to show up, saying that it was all nonsense. Then, she asks if he was crazy for shouting, and wonders what the jealous guy was doing there, since he had an appointment. The despicable guy then says that since it was the protagonist who wrote her paper, that was absurd, and if she dared to take it to the professor, she would certainly be reprimanded. Her friend then, afraid that something might go wrong, also comments that he was just the messenger, and that to prevent anything from going wrong, they couldn't just trust him. Then, Lin suggested they take it to the professor first so he could review it, especially since they didn't have much time to waste arguing about it, and the blonde girl did so, going to the professor to show him her paper. In the faculty room, she calls on her advisor to evaluate her essay. As she was apparently already very late in submitting her report, the old man asked her if she really wanted to graduate. Apologetically, she said she wanted her essay to be the best it could be, which is why it took her a while to finish it. The old man, taking a good look at the girl's essay, was a bit surprised by such a work. Therefore, he asked if she had really been the one who had written it. We all know that wasn't the case, but the girl still said that she was the one who wrote it. The old man realized there was no way she could have written an essay like that, because at her current level, that was certainly something she couldn't do. Poor girl. This time, the one who was surprised was the little blonde, who asked her advisor what he meant. The scoundrel from before, already wanting to further ruin the girl's life, comments that the one who had written that essay was precisely our protagonist. In his thoughts, he figured the professor had made that face because the essay was horrible and now he wanted to see how Lin would get out of this situation. Next, the professor asks what kind of person the protagonist was and if he was really the one who wrote that. To top it all off, a useless being said that the guy wasn't even a student at that school and that he was just a delivery boy. According to this scum of society, the protagonist just wanted to make money any way he could, and that's why he tricked the girl. The old man, upon hearing this, ended up slamming the table, which made the blonde girl terrified of what was to come, and she began to apologize for the mistake she had made. However, to her and everyone else's surprise, the old man was completely impressed with that essay, saying that the work was incredible. That's how you put an end to the delusions of toxic people. You could already see that everyone there was left completely baffled by what was happening. To explain it a little better, the professor said that there weren't even many professors at that school who could produce a paper as well done as that one. When a female professor heard what he said, she asked if he was referring to a high-level essay, and the old man replied that he was. He then told the professor to take it and check it for herself if she didn't believe him, as the professors and students focus in their attention only on the paper the protagonist wrote. We see the scumbag from before on the sidelines, not knowing how to react to the professor's response. To rub it in even more for the scumbag, the professor said that paper could certainly be sent to a scientific journal. The professor didn't know what else to do but call our protagonist a genius, as Lin was a completely humble young man, and exuded humility wherever he went. He simply thanked the professors for the compliments. He said that it was just a common essay and wasn't as impressive as they were saying. From the look on the scumbag's face, you could already tell he didn't like at all that the protagonist had come out of that situation on top. After receiving the compliments, he decided to leave them his card in case they needed anything. The professor wished to have another chance to exchange some ideas with our protagonist in the future. Since there was nothing else for him to do there now, he simply decided to leave them be. The blonde girl from before comments that she'd like to talk to him in case she has any physics questions again in the future. He simply replies that he would when he's free, and finally says goodbye to them. The envious and despicable guy from before asks the girl why she was acting that way, especially since he thought the protagonist was just a delivery guy with a little knowledge of physics. She put the jerk in his place, saying that he was just jealous. Because not only was the protagonist smarter than him, he was also much more handsome. Getting back to Lin, he ended up receiving a call from an employee who told him there had been a problem with the lithography. When he asks what happened, the person replies that the contract and the deposit had been rejected. However, that morning the head of the lithography company said that their institute had credit problems internationally, and that's why he rejected their application. Hearing this, Lin didn't fully understand the problem the person had mentioned. The person on the phone comments that there might be someone trying to sabotage their contract. The protagonist then realizes that no one other than Cisco would want to do something like that. Therefore, he decided to postpone the issue with the lithography machines for now, and that it would take a while until he got to the caller's place. Therefore, she should go help someone else with the development of the new system, until he arrived. In his thoughts, we see that apparently, he wasn't the only one to realize the importance of chips, so there was still a lot to explore there. As soon as he arrived at the Kyushu Pavilion, he received a new order on his app, and the message just said to pick something up but didn't specify what exactly. He called again to find out what it was, and the person told him it was to pick up a bookshelf, so he needed to hurry. There always has to be someone who doesn't care about others, and this time was no different. Lin even tries to argue, saying that the bookshelves were too big, and therefore it would be better for the customer to hire a van to do it. However, the person on the phone said he would pay $100 and the van rental cost at least $200, so if he wasn't going to get it, would file a complaint about our protagonist. As soon as they hung up the phone, he received a sudden message, and the message said that, in light of his recent performance, they would temporarily suspend his status as a delivery driver. He had to report to a specific unit at 9 in the morning the next day so he could receive business training and rejoin the team after passing the evaluation. This left him speechless, especially since it was the second time something similar had happened to him and, practically, for no reason. After that, his friend showed up again and asked him what he talked about when he met with the other party. Apparently, after studying the specific delivery options, the other party said that the contract could be signed first, but the delivery would have to wait a bit. When he sat down for a moment to think more about the matter, he realized that Cisco was already taking control of the patent and was trying to make him look like a copycat when they launched the 1.0 program. He then asked if the young man knew the value of the order he had signed and if he also knew when the second batch of orders would be delivered. He replies that the value was 130 million and the estimated delivery time was about 3 months. Hearing this, he realized that 3 months would be enough to get his move underway. After that, the protagonist asked his friend if he was hungry and if he would like to order something to eat on the way. However, he replies that he is not, but he would still like to borrow something, thinking the young man was going to ask for the car keys. He tells him where the keys are and mentions that there is a sports car in the garage, but to the surprise of the protagonist, his friend was referring to a PlayStation 5 he had seen in his office and asks if he could borrow it. Seeing that the young man was interested in other things, he told him to feel free, but asked if he would not like to go for a ride in a sports car and have a double date. In response, the young man said no and thanked him, but he preferred to spend his time gaming, especially since his recent experience with relationships must have given him some kind of trauma. At this moment, we cut to the Lin building, and we see the Divine Lady's friend organizing things there before they can start operating. The girl then thanks him for having bought so much delicious food for them to try, and he asks where the other young man was so they could have a meeting together. She replies by saying that the other young man was in his office and, therefore, they could go up to have the meeting. In the office, the young man asked if the protagonist had any specific tasks for them, and he said that he needed them to disguise themselves as customers and go to Cisco to help him with the business. Basically, he wanted to buy 1 billion terminal chips. Not understanding what was going on, the girl asked why the disguise, although she understood the business part. Asterisk, asterisk. I refer to the characters by nicknames because I always forget these Korean or Chinese names. Asterisk, asterisk. Then, he replies that he did not actually want to buy the products from Cisco and that they were just going to pretend. Excited by the situation, the girl asked if Cisco had offended him in some way, and he said that offended was just a nickname. It was more like they had climbed on his head and crapped on it. This made her even more excited, and she said they couldn't just let it go. The young man beside her comments that this might not work, because for a project of this magnitude, the other party would certainly evaluate their company's credentials and reputation. Therefore, even if he tries to find a random company to borrow, he would be exposed. With this comment, the protagonist remembered that he had blah blah to be able to do this, and the young man comments that the size of the blah blah company was certainly good, but he wondered why they would cooperate with them. He then replies that he actually owned around 20% of blah blah's shares, so there would be no problem with a temporary agreement between two executive positions. After hearing what their boss said, you could already see that they were speechless. But soon the girl dropped the joke with a hint of truth, saying she wished her boss would adopt her. After that, he left his card with them and, basically, those were the spare keys to his house, so they should go there and get a better car. Because you can't talk business without being well prepared for it. Since she didn't know where the protagonist's house was, she asked where his residence was located. He simply replies by saying it was in the Kyushu Pavilion, which was precisely the most expensive pavilion in the entire city they were in. Before they could continue, they asked Lin to go ahead because they still needed some time to process all that information. After a while, Lin finally arrived at the commercial building, and it seemed there were many people there who needed training. The administrative assistant from the operations department appears, saying that everyone was there for the training test, so they should follow her. As they went up to the place where the training would be held, in the room with all the trainees seated in their assigned spots, she introduced the director of operations, who would be their training instructor. Seeing that the protagonist was there without a uniform, he asked if he was there for a beauty contest, dressed like that, but he replies that if it were a beauty contest, he would be wearing something better, so much so that the director of operations wouldn't even be able to compete with him. The rattlesnake then told him to watch his language, because that was not the place to be ignorant. After that, the director said that each one of them there would pay a compensation of 3 million and would stay there for 3 hours to reflect, and only then would he unlock their privileges. People started to comment among themselves, and some, apparently, did not agree with that fee he had mentioned. The guy in front said they had to pay their dues, otherwise, whoever didn't want to pay just had to leave. At that moment, a young man outraged by the situation says that was going a bit too far on his part, and the director asks what they were talking about, because they were just following the rules and, if he couldn't pay, he just had to leave. So he decided to do just that and said he didn't care about that place, but before leaving he commented that, for some reason, he had recorded exactly what they had just said and was going to post it on the internet, so that everyone could see who they really are. leaving both the scumbag and the rattlesnake surprised that he had done such a thing, especially without them even realizing what was happening. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Now, I have to ask your opinion. What do you think of the story? Let me know in the comments. And give it a rating on a scale of 0 to 10. I'm a little undecided on what score to give it, so I need your help to decide.